Chapter 1. Before Virginia was Virginia, long before the English ships cut across the Atlantic, before names like Jamestown or Williamsburg were written into maps, the land we now call Virginia was already alive with stories, people, and traditions. Imagine standing on the banks of a wide river in the year 1400. The forest rises high and endless. Deer move silently between the trees, and smoke drifts lazily from villages built near the water. This is not wilderness waiting for discovery. It is home. It is a land that has been shaped, cultivated, and honored for thousands of years by the people who walked it, worked it, and preyed upon it. For them, the rivers had voices, the fields had memory, and the sky was a living presence. Long before Virginia became a colony of England, it was the heartland of the Powhatan Confederacy and of many other peoples whose lives wove together a complex and dynamic world. Archaeologists tell us that people had been living in this region for more than 15,000 years. At first, they were hunters following game across a colder, harsher landscape left behind by the Ice Age. They tracked mammoth, bison, and giant sloth, leaving behind stone points and tools buried deep in the soil. Over centuries, as the great animals disappeared and the climate warmed, these early Virginians learned to fish the rivers, gather wild plants, and hunt the forests. They were never static. They adapted, innovated, and passed their knowledge down through stories that outlived generations. By the time Europeans were sailing toward the Chesapeake Bay, these indigenous societies had built a world of villages, trade networks, and cultural traditions as sophisticated in their own way as anything across the ocean. The most powerful of these societies was the Powhatan Confederacy, named after its paramount chief, Wahunsenakau, whom the English would simply call Powhatan. But to see Powhatan only as a man is to miss the scale of what had been built. The Confederacy was a union of about 30 tribes, stretching across the coastal plain of Virginia. Each tribe had its own village, its own leaders, and its own customs, but they were tied together under the authority of Powhatan. This was not an empire in the European sense. There were no marble palaces or armies marching in formation. Instead, there was kinship, diplomacy, and a delicate balance of tribute and protection. Villages paid Powhatan with corn, furs, and shells, and in return they shared in the security of a greater whole. It was a political system that blended flexibility with strength, and it worked. At its height, the Powhatan Confederacy may have included as many as 15,000 people. Daily life in these villages was ordered and purposeful. The people were farmers, and their most important crop was corn, maize, as it is more accurately called. Alongside corn, they grew beans and squash, a trio often referred to as the Three Sisters. These crops supported one another, just as the people who planted them did. Beans climbed the tall stalks of corn, squash leaves shaded the soil to keep it moist, and together they offered a balanced diet of carbohydrates, protein, and nutrients. Around the fields, women worked tirelessly, tending crops, grinding corn into meal, and caring for children. Men hunted deer and turkey, fished the rivers teeming with shad and sturgeon, and traveled to trade with neighboring groups. Children learned early by watching their parents, absorbing the rhythms of life in a community that understood survival as a collective effort. Yet survival was only one part of existence. The people of Virginia also had rich spiritual traditions that gave meaning to their world. They believed that the natural world was filled with power, that spirits inhabited the rivers, the forests, and even the stones. Shamans and priests guided rituals to ensure harmony between humans and these forces. Seasonal ceremonies marked planting and harvest, birth and death. The cycle of the year was tied to the cycle of the cosmos. To dismiss these beliefs as superstition, as many later Europeans did, is to overlook the profound ways in which they guided life, bound people together, and gave purpose to the hardships of survival. The Powhatan were not isolated. Across the Appalachian Mountains lived other groups with different languages and customs, like the Monacan and the Tutelo. To the south and north, other tribes maintained connections through marriage, trade, and sometimes conflict. Shell beads known as wampum circulated widely, not only as adornments, but also as symbols of trust and exchange. Copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Carolinas, and even obsidian from the far west reached Virginia through long chains of barter. These networks remind us that pre-colonial America was not a patchwork of lonely villages, but a continent of moving goods, ideas, and people. What gave the Powhatan Confederacy its particular strength was its organization and its leader. Powhatan himself was shrewd, ambitious, and cautious. He inherited a small chiefdom and expanded it through diplomacy, marriage alliances, and conquest. His authority was both respected and feared. When neighboring villages hesitated to join his confederacy, he sometimes used force. When they agreed, they were bound into a larger web of kinship and obligation. The English, when they arrived, misinterpreted much of this system, thinking in terms of kings and subjects. But the Powhatan world was not ruled by decrees from above. It was sustained by relationships woven carefully over generations. The physical landscape shaped these societies as much as politics did. The Chesapeake Bay and its rivers, James, York, Rappahannock, Potomac, offered fish, transportation, and fertile soil. The coastal plain, with its rolling forests and tidal estuaries, created natural boundaries and opportunities. Villages were typically built near rivers, where canoes carved from tree trunks could launch and fields could be irrigated. Longhouses and smaller thatched dwellings dotted the clearings. Smoke rose from cooking fires where fish roasted and corn boiled in clay pots. Life was not easy. Winters could be harsh, and droughts could bring hunger. But it was a life deeply tied to the land, one that had endured for centuries. Stories and oral traditions kept the past alive. The Powhatan and their neighbors did not write books, but they carried their history in songs, tales, and rituals. Myths explained the origins of the world, the meaning of storms, and the lessons of ancestors. These stories were more than entertainment. They were the framework of identity. A child hearing the tale of how the great hare brought corn to the people was learning not just about food, but about gratitude, obligation, and the sacredness of the harvest. It is easy for us, centuries later, to imagine this world as static, as though life before Europeans was frozen in time. But the reality was far more dynamic. Tribes competed, alliances shifted, and environmental challenges demanded adaptation. A prolonged drought in the early 1600s strained resources and heightened tensions even before the English arrived. Leaders like Powhatan had to navigate not only human politics, but also the unpredictable turns of nature. To govern was to balance all these forces, human, natural, and spiritual. The memory of this pre-colonial Virginia is often overshadowed by what came after. The arrival of settlers, the clash of cultures, the rise of tobacco, and the wars that reshaped the land. Yet, it is important to remember that when the English set foot on the shore in 1607, They did not encounter an empty wilderness. They walked into a land with deep roots, into societies with their own systems of governance, economy, and belief. They encountered people who had already mastered the art of living here, people who saw themselves not as primitive, but as rightful heirs of a sacred landscape. And it was this world, vibrant and complex, that would meet the shock of European arrival. When 3 small ships appeared at the mouth of the Chesapeake, the Powhatan people could not have known how much their world was about to change. But the ground was prepared, the Confederacy strong, and the traditions deep. The next chapter of Virginia's history, one that would bring both opportunity and devastation, was about to begin. Chapter 2: Jamestown and the Birth of English America. The rivers of Virginia had always carried canoes of bark and dugouts of oak. But in the spring of 1607, the water of the Chesapeake Bay bore something altogether different. 3 small wooden ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, appeared on the horizon, their sails full of Atlantic wind, their hulls heavy with men, hopes, and dreams of fortune. To the Powhatan people watching from the shore, they must have looked like floating houses, enormous and strange, an omen of change. For the 104 English settlers aboard, the land that rose before them was not just a new world. It was a chance at survival, profit, and perhaps glory. Yet none of them could have imagined how fragile their dream would be, how close to failure their experiment in colonization would come. These settlers were not the first Europeans to sail into Chesapeake waters. Spanish explorers had passed through decades earlier, probing the coast but never planting a permanent flag. For England, however, the dream of empire was pressing. Rival Spain had already enriched itself with the gold and silver of the Americas. France had established footholds to the north. England was eager not to be left behind. The Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company of merchants and investors, won a charter from King James I, granting them rights to settle and exploit land in this distant continent. They named their new colony after their monarch, Jamestown for James. But names and charters alone would not keep men alive in an unfamiliar land. The settlers chose a site on a marshy peninsula along the James River. At first glance, it seemed defensible, easy to fortify against rivals. But the ground was damp, the water brackish, and mosquitoes swarmed from stagnant pools. Still, they raised a triangular wooden fort, each side 100 feet long, with bastions at the corners. Inside, they built crude houses of timber and thatch, a storehouse, and a church. As the walls rose, so did tensions, within their group and with the people whose land they had entered. Life inside the fort quickly proved harder than anyone expected. Many of the settlers were gentlemen unused to labor. They had come not to farm, but to find gold, to hunt treasure, and to return home rich. But the soil offered no gold, only the promise of corn, and that had to be planted and tended. Disease struck early. Dysentery, typhoid, and salt poisoning from the rivers spread through the cramped fort. The summer heat was suffocating, the winter bitter. By the end of the first year, more than half of the colonists were dead. It was in this crucible of suffering that one figure rose to prominence: Captain John Smith. A soldier of fortune, adventurer, and sometimes braggart, Smith had seen battle in Europe and carried scars from his campaigns. He was not of noble birth, but he had energy, charisma, and above all, discipline. While others dreamed of easy wealth, Smith understood that survival demanded work. "He that will not work shall not eat," he declared, enforcing labor and organizing the colony's efforts. He mapped the rivers, explored the forests, and opened lines of trade with the Powhatan people. Without him, Jamestown might well have withered into the earth before it ever took root. But the English relationship with the Powhatan Confederacy was never simple. At first, the strangers were seen as potential allies, perhaps even as another tribe that could be brought into Powhatan's orbit. Gifts were exchanged: copper and beads from the English, corn and venison from the Powhatan. Yet distrust simmered beneath the surface. The English built fortifications as though expecting attack. They demanded food in lean seasons, sometimes offering trinkets in return, other times taking by force. For the Powhatan, who had their own people to feed, this intrusion was dangerous. It was during one of these tense encounters that John Smith was captured by Powhatan warriors and brought before the chief himself. What happened next has been told and retold so many times that the truth has blurred into legend. Smith later wrote that he was laid out on stones, his head placed for execution, when Powhatan's young daughter, Pocahontas, rushed forward and threw herself across him, sparing his life. The image of the noble maiden saving the foreign adventurer became one of the most enduring myths of American history. But historians now debate whether this was truly an act of mercy or a ritual of adoption, a symbolic performance to incorporate Smith into Powhatan's sphere of influence. Whatever the case, Smith survived, and Pocahontas became forever linked to the story of Virginia's beginnings. Pocahontas herself was just a girl, perhaps 11 or 12 at the time. Her name meant playful one, and to the English she appeared curious, lively, and full of grace. She sometimes visited Jamestown, bringing food or messages, dancing among the rough-hewn houses of the fort. For the English, she seemed a symbol of hope, a bridge between two worlds. For the Powhatan, she was a daughter of their paramount chief, and her actions carried political weight whether she realized it or not. Despite these moments of exchange, Jamestown remained perilously close to collapse. The winter of 1609 to 1610 became infamous as the starving time. By then, John Smith had returned to England after a gunpowder accident, leaving the colony leaderless and divided. Powhatan, weary of the constant demands, cut off supplies. The settlers, unprepared and desperate, ate dogs, cats, rats, even shoe leather. Some resorted to cannibalism. Of the 500 colonists alive at the start of winter, barely 60 survived to see spring. When supply ships finally arrived, they found a colony reduced to skeletons, a settlement that seemed all but doomed. And yet, it did not vanish. More ships came, more settlers disembarked, and against all odds, Jamestown endured. Its survival was not due to luck alone. The colony's persistence rested on hard lessons learned in suffering: that the land demanded labor, that diplomacy with the Powhatan was essential, and that no one would grow rich quickly in this swampy corner of the New World. The first fragile years of Jamestown were filled with contradictions. The settlers clung to dreams of profit even as they starved. They sought friendship with the Powhatan while also raiding their villages. They built England's first permanent foothold in America. Yet, at every moment they hovered on the edge of destruction. In the decades to come, tobacco would transform their fortunes, slavery would shape their society, and Virginia would rise to prominence. But in 1607, nothing was certain. What stood in Jamestown was not an empire or dynasty, but a desperate experiment, born of ambition sustained by sheer will and shadowed by death. And still, the colony held. The sails that had first appeared over the Chesapeake Bay did not vanish again. They multiplied, bringing more people, more goods, and more entanglements. What began with 3 ships, 100 men, and a wooden fort would, in time, grow into the seed of a nation. Yet for those first settlers, weak with hunger, wary of their neighbors, surrounded by an untamed land, every day was a gamble, and every night was uncertain. Jamestown was alive, but only just. Chapter 3. Tobacco, Servants, and Slaves. Jamestown had survived, but just barely. By the second decade of the 1600s, the English settlement in Virginia remained a fragile experiment, a cluster of wooden houses and weary colonists clinging to the edge of a continent that seemed both hostile and promising. Survival alone, however, was not enough. The Virginia Company, which had funded this costly venture, wanted profit. Investors in London demanded to know what riches this strange land could yield. Gold had not materialized. Neither had silver. The colonists had not stumbled upon another Mexico or Peru, nor had they uncovered hidden mines that could satisfy the hunger of Europe's markets. What then could Virginia produce that would make it worth the trouble? The answer, unexpected and transformative, came in the form of a simple plant: tobacco. Tobacco was not entirely new to Europeans. Indigenous peoples had cultivated and smoked it for centuries, using it in rituals and everyday life alike. Spaniards had already brought it back across the Atlantic, and its popularity was spreading across Europe. But English attempts to grow it in their early colonies had been disappointing. The leaves too harsh, the quality too poor. Then, in Virginia, the soil and climate proved different. John Rolfe, a colonist who arrived after the starving time, began experimenting with seeds from the Caribbean. The crop he nurtured along the James River was sweeter, milder, and far more appealing to European tastes. When the first shipments arrived in England, they sold quickly. The demand was insatiable. With tobacco, Virginia finally had its gold. Not the glittering metal that had lured so many across the sea, but a green and fragrant leaf that could be dried, packed, shipped, and sold for profit. Fields that had once grown corn for survival were soon given over to row upon row of tobacco plants. Colonists cleared land with a frenzy, felling trees, burning brush, and exhausting the soil in their pursuit of the cash crop. Tobacco became not just a commodity, but a way of life, shaping the landscape, the labor system, and even the politics of the young colony. Yet growing tobacco was grueling work. It demanded constant attention: planting, weeding, cutting, drying, and packing. Every leaf had to be handled with care. For this, Virginia needed labor, and lots of it. At first, that labor came in the form of indentured servants. These were men and women in England who agreed to work for a set number of years, typically 4 to 7, in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. For the poor, the unemployed, or those seeking a chance at a new start, Virginia offered opportunity. Servants signed contracts, or indentures, that bound them to masters who paid for their voyage. Life as an indentured servant was far from easy. Many found themselves treated harshly, working long hours in the fields under the blazing sun with little freedom. They lived in rough quarters, ate meager food, and endured punishments if they disobeyed. Disease, accidents, and exhaustion claimed many before they ever finished their terms. And yet, the promise of eventual freedom made the bargain attractive. Once their years of service were complete, Servants were often granted freedom dues, land, tools, or clothing that gave them a chance to start anew as independent farmers. This system, harsh though it was, became the backbone of Virginia's workforce in its early decades. Ships arriving from England brought not only goods and supplies, but also men and women who had mortgaged years of their lives for a gamble in America. As tobacco fields spread, so too did inequality. Wealthy planters who could afford more servants gained larger harvests and greater profits, using their wealth to acquire even more land. Smaller farmers struggled to keep up, and many who survived their indentures found themselves pushed to the frontier, away from the best soil and into conflict with native peoples. Virginia was becoming a land of sharp contrasts, opportunity for some, servitude for many, and dispossession for others. The year 1619 brought changes that would echo across centuries. In that year, a Dutch privateer ship arrived at Point Comfort, near present-day Hampton, carrying about 20 Africans. They had been taken from their homeland, brought across the Atlantic in bondage, and exchanged in Virginia for supplies. Their arrival marked the beginning of African slavery in English America. At first, the status of these Africans was not entirely fixed. Some may have been treated like indentured servants, eventually gaining freedom, while others were enslaved for life. Records are fragmentary, and the lines between servitude and slavery blurred in those early years. But the moment was pivotal. What began as a handful of men and women would grow into a system of racial slavery that defined not only Virginia, but the future of an entire nation. The year 1619 also saw another development: the creation of the House of Burgesses, the first representative assembly in English America. Colonists now had a voice in their own governance, a body that could pass laws and manage local affairs, though always under the oversight of the Virginia Company and the Crown. Together, these two events, the arrival of Africans and the birth of self-government, illustrated the paradox that lay at the heart of Virginia. Freedom and bondage, representation and exploitation, democracy and inequality all took root side by side in the same soil. For the Powhatan Confederacy, the rise of tobacco spelled further trouble. As settlers expanded their fields, they encroached deeper into native lands. Forests were cleared, hunting grounds disrupted, and villages threatened. What had begun as uneasy coexistence turned increasingly into conflict. The Powhatan people, who had once held the advantage, now faced a swelling tide of English settlers driven by hunger for land and profit. Tobacco demanded space, and the colonists were willing to take it. The world of Virginia in the 1620s and 1630s was one of rapid transformation. Ships sailed regularly between Jamestown and London, carrying tobacco in one direction and goods, servants, and news in the other. Colonists built houses of sturdier timber, established churches, and expanded beyond the original fort. Death was still common. Disease and hardship continued to stalk the colony. But the population grew steadily. What had once been a desperate foothold was now a society, rough and unequal though it was. Tobacco, however, came at a cost. The crop drained nutrients from the soil, forcing planters to abandon old fields and clear new ones. Forests gave way to fields. Rivers silted with erosion, and the environment bore the scars of relentless cultivation. For every shipment that brought profit to London, there was a toll exacted on the land and on the people whose labor made it possible. Indentured servants endured years of hardship, and the first Africans carried with them the shadow of a system that would grow ever darker. And yet, for many in England, Virginia seemed a place of promise. Advertisements lured would-be settlers with tales of fertile land and opportunity. The colony's leaders promoted it as a land of abundance, where any man willing to work could rise. For those trapped in poverty at home, Virginia offered escape. For merchants and investors, it offered profit. For the crown, it offered a foothold in the great contest of empire. The irony was that Virginia's success was built not on noble ideals, but on a leaf that addicted Europe, and on labor systems that demanded suffering. Tobacco shaped every decision, every relationship, every future in the colony. It was the lure that drew ships across the Atlantic, and the chain that bound men and women, servants, slaves, and planters alike, to an unforgiving cycle of work and want. By the 1620s, the outlines of Virginia's destiny were clear. It would not be a place of quick riches like the Spanish colonies, nor would it remain a small outpost struggling for survival. Instead, it would become a plantation society, tied to the rhythms of tobacco and the labor of those who worked the fields. The colony's story would be written in sweat and smoke, in contracts of indenture and bills of sale, in the lives of men and women who crossed oceans only to find themselves bound in new ways. Virginia had found its gold, but unlike real gold, it could not simply be dug from the earth. It had to be grown, harvested, and shipped year after year. And in that endless demand lay both the colony's prosperity and its curse. The seeds of wealth had been planted, but so too had the seeds of conflict between rich and poor, free and unfree, colonist and native. In 1619, few could see how deep those divisions would run. But the foundation had been laid, and the course of Virginia's history was set. Chapter 4. The First Experiment in Democracy. By the second decade of the 17th century, Virginia was no longer a desperate outpost fighting simply to exist. The colony had discovered its wealth in tobacco, and the profits flowing across the Atlantic encouraged ships to return with more settlers, more supplies, and more ambition. Yet alongside the fields of green that promised fortunes, there grew a different hunger, one not satisfied by crops or trade. It was the hunger for order, for laws that made sense in this new land, and for a voice in deciding how those laws were made. Out of this need emerged something remarkable, something that would outlive tobacco and even the men who planted it. America's first representative assembly, the House of Burgesses. Until this point, Virginia had been governed much like a company outpost. The Virginia Company of London held the charter, appointed governors, and expected its directives to be followed. The colony was, in essence, a business investment, and those who lived and labored on the shores of the James River were expected to serve the company's interests. But the distance between London and Jamestown was vast, and the realities of life in Virginia could not be neatly managed from across an ocean. Fields needed tending, disputes arose between neighbors, crimes were committed, and new settlements sprang up miles away from the fort at Jamestown. For all these matters, the colonists required more immediate, practical governance. In 1619, as tobacco shipments began to stabilize the colony's economy, Governor Sir George Yeardley announced a bold step. He declared that Virginians would elect representatives to sit in a General Assembly, where they could pass local laws and manage their own affairs under the broad authority of the governor and the company. This assembly, meeting for the first time in the heat of July 1619, became known as the House of Burgesses. The very idea of such an assembly was radical in its context. England itself had Parliament, of course, But colonies were not expected to govern themselves in this way. Most European powers of the time ruled their overseas territories through appointed officials, issuing decrees with little regard for the voices of common settlers. In Virginia, however, the company's leaders saw practical advantage in giving colonists a role. If the settlers had a voice in local matters, they might feel more invested in the colony's survival. If they could pass laws suited to their circumstances, the burden on governors would be lighter. What was born out of necessity became, in time, the seed of representative government in America. The first meeting of the Assembly took place in the wooden church at Jamestown, a modest building that smelled of fresh-cut timber and the smoke of nearby hearths. There, 22 burgesses, men elected by the free male inhabitants of each settlement, took their seats. They were not aristocrats sent from London, but colonists themselves. Planters, landowners, men who had endured the trials of life in Virginia and who now sought to shape it. Alongside them sat the governor and his council, representing the authority of the company and the crown. The issues before this assembly were practical, not abstract. They debated how to regulate tobacco prices, how to encourage new industries like ironmaking and shipbuilding, and how to maintain peace with native neighbors. They passed laws against idleness, profanity, and drunkenness, reflecting both the moral codes of their English heritage and the harsh necessity of discipline in a colony still vulnerable to collapse. They set wages, regulated trade, and established rules for the distribution of land. In short, they laid down the framework of a functioning society, one where law did not come only from distant England, but from the voices of those who lived on Virginia's soil. Yet even in this early moment of self-rule, contradictions abounded. The House of Burgesses represented only a narrow slice of Virginia's people. Voting was limited to free white men, primarily landowners. Indentured servants, women, Africans, whether free or enslaved, had no voice. The Assembly spoke of liberty and governance, yet it did so in a society already marked by inequality and bound increasingly to a labor system built on servitude and slavery. The paradox was unmistakable. Democracy for some, bondage for others. Still, for those who could participate, the House of Burgesses was transformative. Colonists accustomed to being subjects of decrees now had the experience of debating, voting, and passing laws. They learned to bargain, to form alliances, to argue their interests. Politics became a lived reality, not an abstract concept. And while the Assembly operated under the watchful eye of governors and company officials, its existence set a precedent that would prove difficult to undo. Once people have had a voice, however limited, it cannot easily be silenced. The Crown, of course, was not blind to these developments. King James I, suspicious of the Virginia Company's management and uneasy about granting too much autonomy to the settlers, revoked the company's charter in 1624. Virginia became a royal colony, governed directly by the Crown. The king appointed governors, and his word was law. Yet even as Virginia shifted from company rule to royal oversight, the House of Burgesses endured. The Crown may have been wary of colonial independence, but abolishing the Assembly outright would have risked unrest. Better, it seemed, to tolerate it, to keep it under the governor's control, and to trust that loyalty to England would remain firm. This uneasy balance between local self-rule and royal authority defined Virginia's political life for decades. The Burgesses could pass laws, but those laws required the governor's approval and could be overturned by the Crown. The colonists relished their assembly, but they also understood its limits. Still, within those limits, they carved out a space for participation, for practice in the arts of debate and governance, and for the building of a political identity that would grow ever stronger. As settlements expanded beyond Jamestown into the fertile lands along the James, the York, and the Rappahannock rivers, the House of Burgesses became the forum where their concerns were voiced. Representatives traveled from scattered plantations and villages to sit together, to argue over taxes, to demand roads and protection, to shape the colony's destiny in ways large and small. This was no abstract parliament of distant aristocrats. It was, for better or worse, the living voice of Virginia's planter class. Over time, the assembly also became a place where tensions with the crown quietly gathered. Colonists who struggled under the weight of taxes imposed by England brought their frustrations to the Burgesses. Planters who resented restrictions on trade aired their grievances in the assembly. While still loyal subjects, Virginians began to develop a sense that they had rights, not just as Englishmen, but as self-governing people. The Crown's authority was accepted, but its reach was measured against the lived reality of colonial lawmaking. In the wooden chambers of the House of Burgesses, seeds of resistance were quietly planted long before open rebellion ever entered the colonists' minds. The very word Burgess, meaning a representative of a borough or town, carried with it the weight of tradition. But in Virginia, far from the stone towns of England, it acquired new meaning. A Burgess was not just a spokesman for a village. He was a participant in the shaping of a new society, one that had to invent itself daily in the face of wilderness, conflict, and uncertainty. The men who sat in that assembly could hardly have foreseen that their humble gathering would be remembered centuries later as the foundation of American democracy. They were preoccupied with prices, with laws against gambling, with how to maintain order in a colony that teetered perpetually between growth and disaster. Yet in those debates lay something larger. The principle that people, even in a distant colony, had a right to govern themselves. As the 1600s wore on, Virginia's House of Burgesses became both symbol and practice. It was a place where the colony's leaders could air disputes, where they could pass laws suited to the rhythms of tobacco and the realities of frontier life, and where they could assert, quietly at first, then more loudly, that they were not merely subjects of royal decree, but active participants in shaping their own destinies. The tensions with the crown did not erupt immediately. For decades, loyalty and obedience coexisted with grumbling and resistance. But the memory of that first meeting in 1619 remained. Virginians had tasted self-rule, and though the taste was bitterly limited, it was real. The House of Burgesses was, in many ways, an imperfect beginning. It was exclusionary, fragile, and always overshadowed by the power of governor and king. Yet it was also a beginning unlike any other in the New World. It was the seed from which later assemblies, conventions, and congresses would grow. In its cramped wooden chamber, democracy in America began to take form, not as an ideal, but as a practice, shaped by the needs and voices of those who worked the land. And just as tobacco had taken root in Virginia's soil, so too did this idea of representation take root in Virginia's mind. It would not vanish, no matter how the crown tried to control it. It would grow, season by season, until one day it would challenge the very empire that had planted the colony in the first place. But for now, in the early decades of the 17th century, it was enough that Virginians had a voice, however constrained, and that they had created something unprecedented in the New World. The House of Burgesses, their first experiment in democracy. Chapter 5. Bacon's Rebellion. By the middle of the 17th century, Virginia had grown far beyond the desperate days of Jamestown's wooden palisades. Tobacco had transformed the colony, drawing ships, settlers, and wealth. The House of Burgesses gave planters a political voice, and across the tidewater rivers, plantations stretched for miles. Yet beneath this apparent prosperity lay tensions as sharp as a knife's edge. The promise of Virginia as a land of opportunity was colliding with the reality of inequality, with the struggles of poor farmers and former servants, and with the constant friction between colonists pushing westward and native peoples defending their homelands. It was in this climate of frustration and division that one of the colony's most dramatic uprisings erupted. Bacon's Rebellion of 1676. A storm fire and fury that shook Virginia to its core. For decades, indentured servitude had supplied much of the labor for Virginia's tobacco economy. Men and women, often young and desperate in England, had bound themselves to years of service in exchange for passage. Those who survived their indentures were supposed to emerge free with land and opportunity. But by the 1670s, the reality was grimmer. The best lands along the tidewater rivers were already claimed by wealthy planters. Freed servants, pushed westward toward the frontier, found themselves facing hostile terrain, poor soil, and the constant danger of conflict with native tribes. Promises of prosperity turned into lives of hardship, frustration, and resentment. At the same time, Virginia's political system was dominated by a small elite. Governor Sir William Berkeley, who had ruled for much of the era, embodied this planter aristocracy. Berkeley was no fool. He had guided the colony through difficult years, encouraged economic diversification, and maintained relative stability. But he also favored the wealthy, restricted voting rights to property holders, and was accused of corruption. Many small farmers and frontiersmen saw the government as indifferent to their struggles, caring more about protecting the interests of large landowners than about the lives of ordinary settlers. The most immediate spark of rebellion, however, came from the frontier wars with Native Americans. As settlers pushed west into the Piedmont and beyond, they encroached on lands belonging to tribes who had already suffered decades of displacement. Skirmishes erupted, raids and counter-raids spread terror on both sides, and the frontier became a zone of constant violence. Poor farmers demanded that the colonial government take strong action, military campaigns to drive out or destroy the native peoples threatening their survival. But Governor Berkeley, cautious and calculating, resisted. He preferred negotiation and treaties, in part because he profited personally from the fur trade with tribes, and in part because he feared the cost of endless war. For the frontiersmen, this reluctance looked like betrayal. Into this atmosphere stepped Nathaniel Bacon, a young, ambitious, and restless member of the gentry. Unlike many of the poor farmers, Bacon was wealthy and well-connected. He had arrived in Virginia only a few years earlier, purchasing land and establishing himself quickly. But he shared the frontier's grievances, especially after a raid by native warriors killed one of his overseers. Whether driven by personal anger, ambition, or genuine sympathy for struggling settlers, Bacon emerged as the unlikely leader of a populist revolt. Bacon demanded a commission from Berkeley to lead volunteers against the native tribes. The governor refused. Defying authority, Bacon and his followers marched west anyway, attacking tribes indiscriminately, including those that had not been hostile. Their actions electrified the frontier settlers, who rallied to Bacon's side but horrified Berkeley and the elite, who saw in Bacon not a hero, but a dangerous rebel. Tensions escalated rapidly, transforming what began as a conflict over Indian policy into a full-blown challenge to the colonial government itself. In the summer of 1676, rebellion erupted. Bacon's supporters, poor farmers, former indentured servants, and disaffected colonists, gathered in force. They railed against the corruption of the ruling elite, accusing Berkeley and his allies of enriching themselves while ignoring the suffering of common people. They demanded harsher war against the tribes and greater opportunity for the poor. Their rhetoric was fiery, appealing to anger that had long simmered beneath Virginia's surface. The colony was suddenly divided between those loyal to the governor and those who saw Bacon as a champion of the people. Bacon's forces marched on Jamestown itself, the seat of government and symbol of authority. In a dramatic confrontation, they compelled the Assembly to grant Bacon the military commission Berkeley had denied him. But the truce was short-lived. When the governor attempted to reassert control, Bacon's army once again descended on Jamestown. This time, they burned it to the ground. Flames consumed the wooden houses, the church, and the Capitol itself, casting a fiery glow over the James River. What had begun as a dispute over frontier defense had become open rebellion against Virginia's ruling class. The rebellion was chaotic, its goals shifting as events unfolded. Some of Bacon's followers sought revenge against native peoples, carrying out brutal raids that blurred any distinction between hostile tribes and peaceful ones. Others were motivated by class resentment, eager to humble the great planters who had monopolized land and power. Bacon himself issued a manifesto and declaration of the people, accusing Berkeley of corruption, favoritism, and failure to protect his colonists. It was a document that mixed frontier grievances with broader appeals to justice and reform. Yet the rebellion was also fragile. Bacon's army was a coalition of the desperate, united more by anger than by coherent strategy. Supplies were scarce, disease spread quickly, and discipline was hard to maintain. Then, in October 1676, fate struck. Nathaniel Bacon fell ill with dysentery. Within days he was dead. Leaderless, the rebellion collapsed. The governor's forces regained control, punishing the rebels with hangings and confiscations. Berkeley reasserted his authority, though not without cost to his reputation. In the aftermath, Jamestown lay in ruins, smoldering ash, a symbol of how close Virginia had come to tearing itself apart. The rebellion had failed to achieve its aims. The frontier remained dangerous. The poor remained landless, and the planter elite retained power. But the shock of the uprising left deep scars and lasting lessons. For the ruling class, Bacon's rebellion was a warning of the volatility within Virginia society. The large population of landless freemen, men who had finished their indentures but had little hope of prosperity, was a source of instability. Their anger could be harnessed by ambitious leaders, and their desperation could erupt into violence. The elite recognized that relying too heavily on indentured servitude created a dangerous underclass, one that might revolt again. Slowly but decisively, Virginia's planters began to turn toward a different labor system, one based less on temporary European servants and more on enslaved Africans, who could be bound for life and whose children would inherit their bondage. The shift was gradual, but Bacon's rebellion marked a turning point in its acceleration. For the poor, the rebellion became a bitter memory of both hope and betrayal. For a moment, it had seemed possible to challenge the dominance of the wealthy and demand greater equality. But without lasting leadership, the movement crumbled, leaving many worse off than before. For Native peoples, the rebellion brought yet another wave of devastation, as indiscriminate attacks fueled cycles of violence and loss. And for Virginia as a whole, Bacon's rebellion revealed the contradictions at its heart. It was a society that spoke of liberty, but practiced inequality, that gave voice to some through the House of Burgesses while silencing many others, that promised opportunity, but delivered hardship to most. The fire that consumed Jamestown in 1676 was more than a blaze of wood and thatch. It was the burning away of illusions, exposing the fault lines of class, race, and power that would shape the colony for centuries to come. When Berkeley was recalled to England shortly after the rebellion, he left behind a Virginia both chastened and hardened. The elite had survived, but they had learned the danger of ignoring the grievances of the many. The poor had been silenced, but their anger had shown how fragile the colony's social fabric truly was. And as Virginia rebuilt from the ashes of Jamestown, it carried forward the memory of 1676, a memory of fire and fury, of rebellion and repression, of a colony that had nearly consumed itself from within. Chapter 6. The Rise of the Planter Elite. The ashes of Jamestown had barely cooled when Virginia began to settle back into its rhythms of tobacco and trade. Bacon's rebellion had flared with anger and died in failure, but its memory lingered in the minds of the ruling class. They had seen firsthand the volatility of a society filled with landless men, restless servants, and poor farmers who could, under the right leader, turn against them with fire and fury. For Virginia's elite, the lesson was clear. Order had to be preserved, stability secured, and the foundation of their power strengthened. In the decades that followed, the colony moved steadily toward a new social order, one that revolved around a small number of powerful families, vast plantations, and a labor system increasingly defined by slavery. It was the rise of the Virginia gentry, an age of hierarchy, wealth, and deep contradictions. The tobacco boom that had begun in the early 1600s continued to shape every corner of Virginia's life. Fields stretched endlessly, forests fell beneath the axe, and ships sailed constantly between the James River and the Thames. With each harvest, planters who could secure labor and land grew richer, while those without struggled to survive. Over time, the imbalance deepened. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a few families who controlled not just tobacco production, but also politics, trade, and land. These families became the core of what would be called the gentry, the planter elite who stood atop Virginia's social pyramid. Plantations were their kingdoms. Along the tidewater rivers, great estates emerged, their houses built of brick instead of timber, with wide porches, tall chimneys, and views over carefully cleared fields. These mansions were not just homes, but symbols of status, declarations of permanence in a land that had once seemed uncertain and temporary. Inside, the gentry displayed imported goods from England, fine furniture, silver, books, and clothing that marked them as refined, connected, and wealthy. Outside, hundreds of acres of tobacco and grain fields spread in every direction, worked by an expanding labor force of enslaved Africans whose bondage was becoming the backbone of the colony. The shift from indentured servitude to slavery was crucial in cementing this social order. After Bacon's rebellion, the planter elite grew wary of the large population of former servants, who, once free, competed for land and sometimes turned resentful and rebellious. Slavery, by contrast, offered a labor force bound for life, whose children would inherit their parents' condition and whose status was defined by race. Laws were steadily passed to draw a permanent line between white and black, servant and slave. By the early 1700s, slavery was no longer a marginal feature of Virginia society, but its defining institution. The wealth of the gentry rested firmly on the backs of enslaved men, women, and children, whose lives were spent in endless labor for the profit of their masters. Hierarchy was everywhere. At the top stood the great planters, owners of vast estates and dozens, sometimes hundreds, of enslaved people. They dominated the House of Burgesses, served as justices of the peace, and wielded authority in both politics and society. Their names carried weight: Byrd, Carter, Randolph, Lee. These families became dynasties, passing wealth and influence down through generations, intermarrying to strengthen their ties, and ensuring that power remained concentrated among a select few. Beneath them were the middling planters, men who owned some land, a few servants or enslaved people, and lived modestly compared to the gentry, but still aspired to rise higher. Many looked upward, hoping through careful marriages, shrewd trade, or sheer luck to join the ranks of the elite. Below them were poor white farmers, often scratching out a living on marginal lands far from the rich tidewater soils. And beneath all stood the enslaved Africans and their descendants, condemned to a lifetime of labor and denied even the faintest hope of freedom. This stratified society was reinforced not only by law and custom, but also by culture. The gentry cultivated an image of refinement and responsibility. They saw themselves as natural leaders, guardians of order, and representatives of civilization in a wilderness. They built Anglican churches near their estates, supported schools for their children, and patronized the arts. In their writings and diaries, they recorded their sense of superiority, contrasting their genteel lives with the supposed roughness of small farmers and the supposed inferiority of those they enslaved. Their world was one of elegant dances, fox hunts, and carefully tended gardens, activities meant to display not just wealth, but taste. And yet, beneath the polished surface of gentry life, contradictions abounded. Their wealth was inseparable from human bondage, from the sweat, pain, and tears of enslaved Africans who toiled in fields, kitchens, and workshops. The refinement of a Virginia planter's household, the silver on the table, the books on the shelves, the silks on the wives and daughters, rested on labor extracted through coercion, violence, and fear. The society that celebrated liberty in its assemblies also enforced bondage on nearly half of its population. For the enslaved, Virginia was a place of unrelenting hardship, but also of resilience. They cleared fields, planted tobacco, harvested grain, and built the very houses in which their masters lived. They endured harsh punishments, separation of families, and the denial of basic rights. But they also forged communities, blending African traditions with new ones born in America. Through song, story, and quiet acts of resistance, they preserved dignity and identity in the face of oppression. Their presence was everywhere in Virginia, even if the official voices of the colony sought to silence or ignore them. The rise of the gentry also reshaped Virginia's politics. The House of Burgesses, once a tentative experiment in representation, became a stage dominated by planter aristocrats. These men debated laws that served their own interests, from regulating tobacco prices to tightening the codes that defined slavery. Governors, appointed by the Crown, often found themselves balancing between royal authority and the powerful families who effectively ran the colony. In this dance of influence, it was usually the gentry who prevailed. ensuring that their privileges were preserved and expanded. Religion, too, served to reinforce hierarchy. The Anglican Church was established as Virginia's official faith, supported by taxes, with ministers often tied to planter families. Church attendance was both a spiritual duty and a social obligation, another stage upon which status was displayed. Yet even within the pews, divisions were clear. The gentry sat prominently, while the poor and the enslaved occupied the margins. Christianity was preached to all, but its promises of equality and salvation existed uneasily beside the daily realities of slavery and inequality. As Virginia moved through the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the gentry's dominance became more secure. Their estates stood as monuments to permanence in a land that had once been precarious. Their families interwove into a network of power that defined Virginia's identity. Visitors from Europe marveled at both the wealth and the contradictions they found. Mansions rising from fields worked by enslaved hands, assemblies that spoke of rights in a society that denied them to so many. Yet even as the planter elite rose to power, they could not escape the fragility of their position. Tobacco markets fluctuated, prices collapsed, and fortunes could rise or fall with the weather. Disease still claimed lives, hurricanes destroyed crops, and conflict with native peoples remained a danger. But the gentry had built a system that could endure these challenges, resting on vast labor forces, political control, and connections across the Atlantic. Virginia was no longer just a colony struggling to survive. It was a society rooted in hierarchy, wealth, and inequality, shaped by the will of its elite. The memory of Bacon's rebellion haunted this world. The gentry had learned its lesson well. They sought to prevent unity between poor whites and enslaved Africans by enforcing racial divisions, granting small privileges to the former while tightening chains on the latter. Laws made slavery hereditary and lifelong, while simultaneously elevating poor whites with rights denied to blacks. It was a deliberate strategy to divide and control, to prevent future uprisings that might threaten the stability of their rule. By the early 1700s, Virginia was a land of contrasts. In the great halls of plantation houses, gentlemen and ladies dined on imported goods, spoke of London fashions, and imagined themselves heirs of English aristocracy. In the fields, enslaved laborers bent their backs from dawn to dusk, their songs echoing the pain and endurance of their lives. On the frontier, poor farmers scratched out survival, sometimes admiring the elite, sometimes resenting them, always caught in the shadow of their power. And in the House of Burgesses, the planter class shaped the laws that bound all these worlds together into one colony. The rise of the planter elite was more than just a shift in wealth. It was the creation of a culture, a way of life, and a political order that would define Virginia for generations. It gave the colony stability and prestige, but at the cost of freedom for many. It created a ruling class that would one day produce the statesmen who declared independence and spoke of liberty, even as they held others in chains. And it left Virginia marked by a paradox it would never fully escape. The pursuit of refinement and power, built upon the foundations of slavery and inequality. Chapter 7. Virginia's Founding Fathers. The Virginia of the 18th century was a land dominated by its planter elite, a world of sprawling estates, brick mansions, and tobacco fortunes built on the backs of enslaved labor. The gentry had carved out a society that combined the elegance of English aristocracy with the rough realities of the New World. Yet for all its refinement, Virginia was still a colony, subject to the authority of a distant king and parliament across the Atlantic. And in that tension between privilege at home and subordination abroad, the seeds of revolution were sown. From its fields and plantations, its courthouses and assembly halls, Virginia would emerge not just as a prosperous colony, but as the cradle of the American Revolution, giving the new nation many of its most influential voices and leaders. The rise of this revolutionary spirit did not come suddenly. For decades, Virginians had enjoyed a degree of autonomy through the House of Burgesses. They passed local laws, debated taxes, and managed their own affairs, even if the Crown reserved the final say. But as the British Empire tightened its grip in the mid-18th century, seeking revenue after costly wars in Europe and America, colonists began to feel the weight of authority more heavily. Taxes on imports, restrictions on trade, and the quartering of British soldiers stirred resentment. To the planters of Virginia, men accustomed to commanding their own households and dominating their local assemblies, such intrusions struck at both their pocketbooks and their pride. One of the first to give voice to this resentment was Patrick Henry. A lawyer known for his fiery style and fearless arguments, Henry rose to prominence in the 1760s. In the House of Burgesses, as Parliament passed the Stamp Act of 1765, Henry thundered against what he saw as tyranny. He reminded his fellow legislators of ancient English rights and warned that King George III risked becoming a despot if he continued to tax his subjects without their consent. Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, he declared, drawing gasps in the chamber as he hinted at the fate of tyrants. Though some accused him of treason, his words electrified the colony. For ordinary Virginians, Henry's speeches carried the raw energy of rebellion, transforming discontent into defiance. As tensions with Britain deepened, Virginia became a center of political coordination. Its planters and lawyers corresponded with leaders in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas, forming networks of resistance. When the colonies convened the First Continental Congress in 1774, Virginia sent a delegation that included Henry, Richard Henry Lee, and George Washington. They carried with them the authority of the largest and most populous colony, and their presence gave weight to the cause of unity. Virginia's voice mattered, and it spoke increasingly in tones of defiance. In March 1775, on the eve of open conflict, Patrick Henry gave what would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. At the Virginia Convention in Richmond, as delegates debated whether to prepare for war, Henry rose once more. With passion burning in his voice, he declared that all attempts at reconciliation with Britain had failed, that the colonies must arm themselves, that the time for action had come. "I know not what course others may take," he cried, "but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." The words rang like a bell across Virginia, echoing in hearts already restless for freedom. They captured the spirit of a colony that, though ruled by elites, was ready to gamble everything in the fight for independence. If Henry gave the Revolution its voice, another Virginian would give it its pen. Thomas Jefferson, born into the planter class at Shadwell near Charlottesville, was a man of intellect and ideas. Tall, reserved, and bookish, Jefferson devoured Enlightenment philosophy, studied law, and cultivated a belief in natural rights and human liberty. When the Second Continental Congress needed a declaration to justify the colony's break with Britain, it was Jefferson who was chosen to draft it. Alone in a rented room in Philadelphia, he wrote with measured eloquence that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Though edited by his colleagues, Jefferson's words became immortal, a creed not only for a rebellion, but for a nation. Yet Jefferson's soaring ideals carried a contradiction that could not be ignored. He himself owned enslaved people, his wealth and comfort sustained by their forced labor. In Virginia, the rhetoric of liberty coexisted uneasily with the reality of bondage. Many revolutionaries recognized this paradox. Some even condemned it. But few were willing to confront it directly. The revolution was fought in the name of freedom, but for whom that freedom truly applied would remain an open question. If Henry gave fire and Jefferson gave philosophy, it was George Washington who gave leadership. Born into the Virginia gentry, Washington had built his reputation as a soldier during the French and Indian War. Tall, commanding, and disciplined, he embodied the qualities of steadiness and resolve. When Congress appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in 1775, it was not just his military skill that mattered, but also his Virginian identity. With New England already in revolt, placing a Virginian at the head of the army helped bind the southern colonies to the cause. Washington accepted the role with humility, declaring that he hoped his abilities were equal to the task, though in truth no man's could have been. Throughout the long years of war, Washington became the figure around whom the revolution rallied. He led troops through defeats and retreats, through freezing winters and desperate shortages, never abandoning the cause. His very presence steadied men who might otherwise have broken. Though battles were fought in many colonies, and victories often came slowly, Washington's leadership ensured that the struggle endured until independence was won. Virginia's contribution to the Revolution went beyond its famous leaders. Its land and resources became vital to the cause. Supplies, troops, and money flowed from the colony into the continental effort. Planters who had once shipped tobacco to London now pledged fortunes to the army. Farmers who had known only the rhythm of crops took up muskets. Even enslaved people saw the upheaval as an opportunity, some escaping to join British lines in exchange for promises of freedom, others serving in colonial militias. The war touched every level of Virginia society, reshaping lives in ways that would not be forgotten. As the conflict raged on, Virginia remained at the heart of the struggle. Its leaders debated strategy in Philadelphia, its soldiers marched north and south, and its people endured the hardships of war. In the end, the Revolution's decisive victory came on Virginia soil. At Yorktown in 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered to Washington, sealing American independence. The war that had begun with fiery speeches and philosophical declarations ended with the triumph of arms, and Virginia stood at the center of it all. The Revolution transformed Virginia's identity. Once a proud colony of England, it emerged as a state in a new republic, a place whose sons had played leading roles in securing freedom. Yet the contradictions remained. Liberty had been proclaimed, but slavery endured. Equality had been declared, but hierarchy persisted. The voices of Henry, Jefferson, and Washington had carried a people to independence, but the world they built still reflected the power of the planter elite. Still, in the eyes of history, Virginia had been the cradle of the Revolution. Its orators gave it fire, its thinkers gave it philosophy, its generals gave it strength. No colony contributed more to the birth of the United States, and none left a deeper imprint on the nation's founding story. From the church in Richmond, where Patrick Henry demanded liberty, to the halls of Philadelphia, where Jefferson wrote of equality, to the fields of Yorktown, where Washington secured victory, Virginia had given the Revolution its soul. And so, as the smoke of the battle cleared and the new republic struggled to define itself, Virginia stood not only as a state, but as a symbol, the birthplace of leaders, the forge of ideas, the heart of a revolution that would shape the destiny of a continent. Chapter 8. From Colony to Commonwealth. The Revolution had begun with fiery words and bold declarations, and in Virginia those words had echoed louder than anywhere else. Patrick Henry had demanded liberty or death. Thomas Jefferson had declared that all men were created equal. George Washington had taken command of the Continental Army. Yet for all the speeches and promises, Virginia was still, in the eyes of Britain, a colony in rebellion, a distant territory defying its rightful king. That would change with a single document and a long war that tested the endurance of every colony. Virginia, once proud to be England's oldest possession in the New World, now prepared to shed its colonial skin and emerge as a Commonwealth, a sovereign state in a nation unlike any the world had seen before. The moment of transformation began in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776. Delegates from the 13 colonies gathered in the Pennsylvania State House, debating whether to make the final break from Britain. The risks were immense. To sign a Declaration of Independence was to commit treason in the eyes of the Crown, to invite the gallows if the rebellion failed. Yet the tide of events was carrying them forward. Skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, the bloodshed at Bunker Hill, the siege of Boston, and the king's refusal to reconcile had convinced many that there was no turning back. It was Thomas Jefferson, the quiet Virginian, who drafted the words that would proclaim this transformation to the world. Alone with his pen, he distilled the Enlightenment into sentences that would outlast the Revolution itself. He wrote not of colonies, but of people, not of grievances alone, but of universal truths, that all men are created equal, that they possess rights that no king could grant or take away, that governments exist to secure those rights and could be overthrown when they failed. Jefferson's draft, revised by his colleagues, became the Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4th, 1776. When the parchment was signed, Virginia was no longer a colony. It was one of 13 United States, joined in a common cause of liberty. But declarations alone could not make nations. They had to be defended with blood and sacrifice, and Virginia bore its share of both. Its men joined Washington's army, leaving behind farms and plantations to fight in distant battles from New York to New Jersey to Pennsylvania. Some never returned, falling in muddy fields far from home. Others endured winters of hunger and cold, their endurance tested by more than the muskets of the enemy. At home, Virginia itself became a battleground. British ships sailed into the Chesapeake, raiding towns and plantations, sowing fear along the tidewater rivers. The war was not distant. It was here, in the very heart of the colony. The most dramatic chapter came at the war's end, when Virginia itself became the stage for the final act. By 1781, the Revolution had dragged on for 6 long years. Washington had held his army together by sheer will, but victories had been scarce. Then fortune shifted. British General Cornwallis marched his troops into Virginia, fortifying the small port of Yorktown on the York River. From there, he believed he could strike at the colonies or retreat by sea if necessary. It was a bold move, but it placed him in a trap. Washington and his French allies seized the opportunity. Marching south with American troops and supported by the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, they surrounded Cornwallis at Yorktown. For weeks, cannons thundered and musket fire echoed as trenches crept closer to the British lines. Virginia's soil shook with the fury of war. Then, on October 19th, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his army. The fields of Yorktown became the ground where Britain's empire faltered and America's independence was secured. Soldiers laid down their arms as fife and drum played a bitter tune, and the eyes of the world turned to Virginia. The Revolution had begun with words in Philadelphia, but it ended with victory in Virginia. The surrender at Yorktown did not instantly end the war, but it broke Britain's will. Negotiations followed, and in 1783 the Treaty of Paris formally recognized American independence. Virginia, once a colony bound to the crown, now stood as a free state within a new union. Yet this transformation was not merely political. It reshaped every corner of Virginia's life, from its governance to its identity. In 1776, even before the Declaration in Philadelphia, Virginians had already declared their own independence at home. That spring, the 5th Virginia Convention met in Williamsburg and adopted the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written largely by George Mason. This document proclaimed the principles of individual liberty and limited government, principles that would echo in both the Federal Bill of Rights and constitutions across the new republic. It also gave Virginia a new constitution, establishing its government as a Commonwealth, a term drawn from English tradition but imbued with new meaning in America. The word suggested a political community built for the common good, not merely for the benefit of a monarch or a privileged few. Virginia was no longer a colony. It was a commonwealth, sovereign and self-governing. The Revolution also reshaped Virginia's leadership. Its great men, many drawn from the planter elite, now turned their talents to building a republic. Washington, triumphant at Yorktown, would one day become the nation's first president. Jefferson, author of the Declaration, would later serve as its third. James Madison, another Virginian steeped in philosophy and politics, was rising in influence, destined to play a central role in drafting the Constitution. The state that had once been England's proudest colony was now the nursery of American leadership, producing a dynasty of statesmen whose influence would define the new nation. Yet even as Virginians celebrated independence, the contradictions of their society persisted. The rhetoric of liberty resounded in speeches and documents, but slavery remained embedded in the fabric of the Commonwealth. Enslaved men and women had heard Jefferson's words and Washington's proclamations, and many wondered if liberty would ever extend to them. Some had seized opportunities during the war, escaping to British lines where freedom was promised, or serving in militias in hopes of gaining manumission. But for the vast majority, independence brought no change. The planter elite who had fought for their own freedom had little intention of surrendering the system that sustained their wealth. The paradox of a nation built on liberty and slavery was nowhere more visible than in Virginia. Still, the Revolution left its mark on every Virginian. Farmers who had marched in militias returned with stories of battles and sacrifice. Families who had endured raids rebuilt their homes and barns. Towns scarred by war began to grow again, their markets now oriented not toward London, but toward Philadelphia, New York, and the broader world. The Chesapeake Bay, once a highway of imperial trade, became a channel of Republican commerce. The colony had been a piece of empire. The Commonwealth was a partner in a new experiment. The legacy of Yorktown gave Virginians a deep sense of pride. They believed their soil had seen the birth of independence. Their leaders had given voice and form to the Republic. Their sacrifices had secured its survival. In taverns and churches, in courthouses and plantations, they spoke of Virginia as the heart of the new nation, the place where revolution had been transformed into victory. That pride would carry forward into the politics of the early republic, sometimes as inspiration, sometimes as arrogance, but always with the conviction that Virginia mattered. The transformation from colony to Commonwealth was not smooth or simple. It demanded war, loss, and upheaval. It demanded new forms of government and new identities. But by the end of the Revolution, Virginia had remade itself. It was no longer the old dominion of the crown. It was a commonwealth, part of a nation that claimed liberty as its creed, even as it wrestled with its contradictions. Its people had endured occupation, raids, and the sacrifices of war, and they emerged with a sense of destiny. As the smoke of Yorktown faded and peace settled over the fields of Virginia, the colony of England was gone forever. In its place stood a commonwealth, proud and powerful, ready to shape the course of a young republic. The men who had led it, Washington, Jefferson, Henry, Mason, were not merely Virginians now, but founding fathers of a nation. And the land that had once been an outpost of empire was now the soil of independence. The story of Virginia as a colony had ended. The story of Virginia as a state in a new union had begun. Chapter 9. Presidents from Virginia. When the guns fell silent at Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris confirmed independence, Virginia stood proud. Its fields had witnessed the final triumph of the Revolution. Its leaders had drafted the words of freedom, and its people had borne the burdens of war. Yet the true challenge still lay ahead: creating a government that could bind 13 very different states into one nation. In that uncertain beginning, it was again Virginia that supplied the leaders who would guide the Republic's early steps. From Mount Vernon, Monticello, Montpelier, and Ashlon Highland came 4 men whose presidencies shaped America's direction: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. Their dominance was so complete that history remembers it as the Virginia dynasty. The first was George Washington, the soldier who had led the Continental Army to victory. He did not seek power. In fact, he longed to return to his estate at Mount Vernon, to live quietly among his fields. But the nation needed him. In 1787, as the Articles of Confederation faltered, Washington presided over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. His presence lent credibility to the effort, his calm authority steadying debates that might have collapsed into chaos. When the Constitution was ratified, the people turned to him as their first president, a choice so obvious it seemed inevitable. Washington's presidency set precedents that still endure. He established the cabinet, balancing the voices of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. He steered the fragile republic through crises, refusing entanglement in European wars while strengthening the authority of the federal government. When protesters in western Pennsylvania resisted a whiskey tax, Washington personally led troops to show that the new nation could enforce its laws. Yet he never clung to power. After 2 terms, he stepped down voluntarily. setting the standard of peaceful transition that would become a cornerstone of American democracy. To Virginians, he was the embodiment of their state's leadership. To the nation, he was the indispensable man. After Washington retired, the presidency eventually returned to another Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson's genius lay not in the battlefield, but in words and ideas. As president, beginning in 1801, he sought to make the Republic an empire of liberty, a vast land of farmers and free citizens. His election itself marked a turning point. The bitter campaign of 1800, pitting him against John Adams, ended in a peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another, a revolutionary act in its own right. Jefferson called it the Revolution of 1800, proof that disputes in America could be settled with ballots rather than bayonets. Jefferson's presidency brought great achievements and deep contradictions. In 1703, he authorized the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of the nation and securing land that stretched to the Rocky Mountains. This bold move, though not clearly permitted by the Constitution he so revered, ensured America's future as a continental power. He sent Lewis and Clark to explore the new territory, mapping rivers and mountains, encountering tribes, and planting the seeds of westward expansion. Yet Jefferson's vision of a republic of small farmers contrasted with the reality of his own life. He remained a planter at Monticello, dependent on enslaved labor even as he championed liberty. His words inspired revolutions abroad, yet at home they coexisted uneasily with bondage. When Jefferson left office, another Virginian stepped forward, James Madison, the father of the Constitution. Madison had been Jefferson's close ally, a master of political philosophy and detail. His presidency, beginning in 1809, was marked by challenge. Tensions with Britain over trade and the impressment of American sailors erupted into the War of 1812. Critics called it Mr. Madison's War, and in its early years, the conflict went badly. The British burned Washington, D.C., forcing Madison and his wife Dolly to flee as the Capitol and White House went up in flames. Yet resilience prevailed. American forces won key battles, and the war ended with a sense of renewed independence. Though costly and divisive, the War of 1812 confirmed the nation's survival and cemented Madison's place in history. Madison's leadership have also underscored the strength of Virginia's influence. He carried forward Jefferson's vision of republicanism, wary of centralized power, yet committed to the Constitution he had helped craft. His intellect, though less fiery than Jefferson's or Henry's, gave coherence to the principles on which the nation rested. If Washington had embodied leadership and Jefferson had given ideals, Madison had provided structure. Together, they defined the framework of the early republic. The last of the Virginia dynasty was James Monroe, who took office in 1817. A veteran of the Revolution and protege of both Jefferson and Madison, Monroe symbolized continuity. His presidency became known as the Era of Good Feelings, a time of relative political harmony after years of factional strife. Under his leadership, the United States acquired Florida from Spain and confronted issues of expansion and slavery with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. But Monroe is best remembered for a doctrine that bore his name. In 1823, he declared that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open to European colonization, warning European powers to stay out of the affairs of the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine, bold and assertive, signaled that the United States had grown from fragile republic to emerging power. Monroe's Virginia heritage, like that of his predecessors, was always present. He lived at Ashlawn Highland, not far from Jefferson's Monticello, part of the same circle of planter statesmen who dominated national politics. He too owned enslaved people, and he too wrestled with the paradox of a republic that proclaimed liberty while sustaining bondage. Yet his presidency marked the culmination of Virginia's dominance in American leadership. For the first 50 years of the Republic, 4 of its 5 presidents hailed from the Old Dominion. Together, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe guided the nation through revolution, expansion, war, and diplomacy, shaping its institutions and ideals. The Virginia dynasty was more than coincidence. It reflected the unique position Virginia held in the new republic. As the largest and most populous state, with deep traditions of self-government through the House of Burgesses, it was natural that its leaders would rise to national prominence. The gentry class, educated and wealthy, saw politics as their duty and their right. They brought with them the confidence of men accustomed to command, the polish of European culture, and the ambition of those who believed they were building history. Their estates, Mount Vernon, Monticello, Montpelier, Ash Lawn Highland, became as symbolic as any battlefield, monuments to a Virginia identity that fused refinement, power, and contradiction. Yet beneath the grandeur of the Virginia dynasty, the old paradox remained. These presidents spoke of liberty and shaped institutions of freedom, but they were also products of a society built on slavery. Washington freed his enslaved workers only upon his death. Jefferson penned the Declaration's immortal words, yet held hundreds in bondage. Madison, architect of rights, never extended them to those who labored in his fields. Monroe, who declared the hemisphere off-limits to European empires, maintained the plantation order at home. Their leadership was visionary, but their legacy was entangled with injustice. Still, in the story of the United States, the Virginia dynasty looms large. These 4 men gave the new nation stability when it might have faltered, expansion when it might have stagnated, and principles when it might have lost its way. They carried forward the Revolution's promises, even as they left unresolved the contradictions that would later test the Republic. Their presidencies ensured that America not only survived, but grew, from a fragile union on the Atlantic coast to a nation with continental ambitions and global presence. For Virginia, the era of the dynasty was a golden age of influence. No other state could claim such dominance over the nation's highest office. The Old Dominion had been the first colony, the birthplace of revolution, and now the nursery of presidents. Its sons shaped the nation's destiny in ways profound and lasting. And though the age of Virginia's presidential dominance would fade, its imprint on the foundations of the Republic would remain forever. As the 1820s dawned, the Virginia dynasty reached its end. New voices rose from beyond the Old Dominion, men from the frontier and from other states who would carry the presidency into a different era. But for nearly half a century, Virginia had been at the center of American leadership. The story of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe was not just the story of 4 men. It was the story of how a single state, born from tobacco fields and forged in revolution, had defined the early direction of a nation. Chapter 10: Slavery, Cotton, and Cracks in the Union. The age of the Virginia dynasty had placed the Old Dominion at the very heart of America's early political life. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe carried the new nation from fragile beginnings to expanding strength. But even as Virginia celebrated its prominence on the national stage, a darker reality was tightening its grip. The Commonwealth that had given America its creed of liberty was also bound to the institution of slavery more deeply than ever before. And in the decades after the Revolution, as cotton spread across the South, Virginia's role shifted from being not just a society sustained by enslaved labor, but also a supplier of human beings to the vast new plantations of the Deep South. It was in this age that slavery's contradictions became impossible to ignore, and cracks in the Union began to appear. Slavery had been present in Virginia since 1619, when the first Africans were brought to Point Comfort. Over the next 2 centuries, it became the foundation of the colony's economy and society. By the early 1800s, nearly half of Virginia's population was enslaved. Plantations from the Tidewater to the Piedmont depended on their labor to cultivate tobacco, wheat, and other crops. Enslaved men, women, and children worked the fields from dawn to dusk, lived in quarters of rough timber, and endured lives marked by toil, punishment, and the denial of freedom. The planter elite built their wealth on this system, and it became so deeply woven into Virginia's fabric that many could not imagine life without it. Yet, as the 19th century progressed, tobacco, once Virginia's gold, was losing its luster. The soil, exhausted by decades of cultivation, no longer produced the rich yields of earlier times. Planters diversified into wheat, corn, and livestock. But these crops did not demand the same intensity of labor. Meanwhile, in the Deep South, a new crop was transforming the economy: cotton. With the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, lands in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and later Texas became fields of white gold. Cotton required vast labor, and enslaved Africans provided it. Suddenly, demand for enslaved people skyrocketed. Virginia, with its large enslaved population and declining need for labor at home, became the hub of a grim commerce: the domestic slave trade. Families were torn apart as men, women, and children were sold down the river to the expanding cotton frontier. Slave markets in Richmond, Alexandria, and other cities grew busy with traders who profited from human misery. Coffles of chained men marched southward. Ships carried their human cargo along the coast. For Virginia's economy, the trade provided revenue at a time when agriculture faltered. But for those enslaved, it was devastation beyond measure. The breaking of kinship ties, the loss of home, the uncertainty of life in distant fields. This internal trade exposed the moral contradictions of Virginia more starkly than ever. The state that had produced Jefferson's words about liberty and equality was also a supplier of enslaved people to the harshest plantations of the Deep South. Many Virginians saw no contradiction. To them, slavery was a way of life, a necessary institution for economic survival. Others, however, felt the weight of hypocrisy. Some advocated gradual emancipation, while others sought colonization schemes to send freed blacks to Africa. But for the great majority of the planter class, slavery was defended with increasing vigor, justified by arguments of race, economy, and tradition. The enslaved themselves resisted in ways large and small. They slowed their work, broke tools, feigned illness. They created families, churches, and communities that gave them strength and identity in the face of oppression. Spirituals carried messages of hope and defiance. Some ran away, following the paths that would later become part of the Underground Railroad. Others dreamed of rebellion, of striking directly against their oppressors. That dream erupted most dramatically in 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia. There, an enslaved preacher named Nat Turner believed he had been chosen by God to lead his people out of bondage. Turner was deeply religious, known among enslaved and free blacks alike as a man of vision. He claimed to see signs and hear divine voices urging him to act. On the night of August 21st, 1831, he and a small band of followers rose in revolt. Moving from plantation to plantation, they killed dozens of white men, women, and children, hoping to spark a wider uprising. The rebellion lasted 2 days before being crushed by militia and federal troops. Turner was captured weeks later, tried, and hanged. His body was mutilated, his movement extinguished. But the impact of Nat Turner's rebellion reverberated far beyond Southampton County. White Virginians, terrified of more uprisings, responded with brutal reprisals. Hundreds of enslaved people, many uninvolved in the rebellion, were killed in the aftermath. Laws were passed tightening restrictions on both enslaved and free blacks. Education for African Americans was prohibited, religious gatherings were restricted, and patrols were increased. The rebellion hardened attitudes on both sides. For enslaved people, Turner became a symbol of resistance, proof that the yearning for freedom could not be extinguished. For slaveholders, he was a warning that the institution they depended upon was also a source of fear and instability. The debate over slavery in Virginia reached a turning point in 1832, when the state legislature considered proposals for gradual emancipation in the wake of Turner's rebellion. For a moment, it seemed possible that Virginia might lead the South toward ending slavery. But the motion failed, defeated by planters who insisted that slavery was indispensable. From that point forward, open criticism of slavery in Virginia grew rarer, and defenses of the institution grew stronger. Slavery was no longer spoken of as a necessary evil, but increasingly as a positive good, ordained by God and essential to civilization. The cracks in the Union were widening, and Virginia stood at the center of the divide. The sectional conflict grew sharper as the decades advanced. In the North, abolitionist movements gained strength, publishing tracts, organizing societies, and demanding an end to human bondage. In the South, including Virginia, politicians defended slavery with ferocity, portraying it as vital to both economy and culture. National debates over the admission of new states, whether they would be free or slave, put Virginia's interests in constant tension with those of other regions. Compromises patched over the divisions for a time, but each one deepened the sense that the Union was fragile. For ordinary Virginians, life continued within the framework of this system. The gentry lived in their brick mansions, presiding over plantations sustained by enslaved labor. Yeoman farmers worked smaller plots, sometimes owning 1 or 2 enslaved people, sometimes none, but nearly always identifying themselves with the rights of slaveholders. Enslaved men and women endured the daily grind of labor, their resilience holding families and communities together despite the constant threat of sale. The domestic slave trade continued to funnel thousands southward each year, enriching traders and planters while leaving scars that would never heal. By the middle of the 19th century, the contradictions were stark. Virginia, the birthplace of liberty, remained chained to slavery. Its leaders had spoken of equality, yet half its people were denied the most basic rights. Its fields had seen the victory of independence, yet its economy now depended on the sale of human beings. And as the Union strained under the weight of sectional conflict, the cracks first visible in Virginia threatened to break the nation apart. The story of slavery in Virginia was not just the story of bondage, but of division. Division between masters and enslaved, between Eastern planters and Western farmers, between defenders of tradition and advocates of change. It was a story that revealed the deep fault lines in American society, fault lines that no compromise could fully mend. Nat Turner's rebellion had shown the explosive potential of resistance. The domestic slave trade revealed the cruelty at the system's heart. The debates in Virginia's legislature showed how close, and yet how far, the state had come from ending slavery. As the 1850s loomed, the contradictions would only sharpen. The Union was cracking, and Virginia's role, once the cradle of revolution, once the nursery of presidents, would soon be tested again in the most violent conflict of all. But before that reckoning, Virginia's society remained as it had become, a land of elegance and brutality, of liberty proclaimed and liberty denied, of wealth built upon bondage and fear. The Old Dominion was still powerful, still proud, but the foundations on which it stood were crumbling, and no one could yet see how devastating the collapse would be. Chapter 11. Civil War. The cracks in the Union had grown deeper with every passing decade, and by the election of 1860, they could no longer be ignored. Abraham Lincoln's victory, without carrying a single Southern state, convinced many across the South that their way of life was in mortal danger. South Carolina seceded first, followed by other deep South states. Virginia, however, hesitated. For all its defense of slavery, the Old Dominion was bound by pride in its legacy as the birthplace of the nation, the home of Washington and Jefferson, Madison and Monroe. Could Virginia really abandon the Union it had done so much to create? The debate tore at its soul. At first, Virginia resisted the call to secession. Many hoped compromise could still preserve both Union and slavery. But when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, and Lincoln called for troops to put down the rebellion, the question became unavoidable. To send soldiers against fellow Southern states was unthinkable for many Virginians. On April 17, 1861, the Virginia Convention voted to secede. Days later, Richmond was chosen as the capital of the Confederacy. The irony was profound. The very state that had given America its first leaders now stood at the center of a new rebellion against that same nation. Richmond became more than just a symbol. Its location offered industrial capacity, railroads, and proximity to the front lines. The Tredegar Iron Works, one of the largest foundries in the South, supplied cannons and munitions. Government buildings rose quickly to house Confederate leaders, including President Jefferson Davis. Mansions became offices, warehouses became arsenals, and the city, already bustling with tobacco trade, transformed into the beating heart of the Confederate experiment. To capture Richmond became the Union's obsession. To defend it became the Confederacy's greatest priority. The war in Virginia began almost immediately. In July 1861, Union and Confederate forces clashed near Manassas, in Prince William County. The First Battle of Bull Run, as Northerners called it, or First Manassas to Southerners, shattered illusions on both sides. Civilians had gathered on nearby hillsides to picnic, expecting a quick and decisive Union victory. Instead, the battle descended into chaos, with Confederate forces, led in part by General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, holding firm. Union troops broke and fled back toward Washington. The war, it was clear, would not be short or easy. Virginia's soil was baptized in blood, and it would see far more in the years ahead. Again and again, Virginia became the stage for epic battles. In 1862, Union General George McClellan launched the Peninsula Campaign, marching his army up the peninsula between the York and James Rivers, with Richmond as his prize. The city lay within reach, but Confederate forces, led by General Robert E. Lee, counterattacked in the 7 days' battles. McClellan retreated, and Richmond was saved. The pattern repeated itself across the years. Union armies driving toward Richmond, Confederate forces fighting desperately to hold them back. The land between Washington and Richmond became a corridor of carnage, marked by names that would echo through history: Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Cold Harbor. Robert E. Lee himself was Virginia's most famous son of the war. Born at Stratford Hall, heir to one of the great Virginia families, Lee had served with distinction in the U.S. Army. When secession came, he agonized over his choice. Offered command of Union forces, he declined, declaring that he could not raise his sword against his native state. Instead, he cast his lot with Virginia and the Confederacy, becoming commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. Under his leadership, Confederate forces won stunning victories despite being outnumbered and outsupplied. His maneuvers at Second Manassas, his triumph at Fredericksburg, and his audacious victory at Chancellorsville made him a legend. For a time, it seemed as though Lee and Virginia might carry the Confederacy to success. But war is not won by brilliance alone. The Union's resources were vast, its armies replenished, its factories relentless. In July 1863, Lee's invasion of the North ended in defeat at Gettysburg. Though the battle took place in Pennsylvania, its shadow fell heavily on Virginia. From that point on, the war turned inexorably against the Confederacy. Union General Ulysses S. Grant, appointed in 1864, brought relentless pressure, hammering at Lee's army again and again. Battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor turned Virginia's fields into slaughterhouses. Grant's strategy was simple: destroy Lee's army and capture Richmond, no matter the cost. Richmond, meanwhile, groaned under the weight of war. Its streets overflowed with wounded soldiers brought from the front. Hospitals filled, food grew scarce, and inflation devastated families. In April 1863, women rioted in the streets over the price of bread, shouting for relief as Confederate soldiers struggled to maintain order. The city that symbolized Confederate pride also embodied its suffering. By 1864, Grant had shifted his focus to Petersburg, south of Richmond, where rail lines supplied the capital. The siege of Petersburg dragged on for nearly 10 months, trench lines stretching for miles in a grim preview of modern warfare. Confederate soldiers, exhausted and hungry, held on desperately, but the end was near. In April 1865, Union forces finally broke through. Richmond was evacuated. Fires set by retreating Confederates spread through the city, consuming warehouses and homes. On April 3rd, Union troops marched into the smoldering capital. The great prize had fallen. Lee fled west with what remained of his army, hoping to join forces with other Confederate troops. But Union pursuit was relentless. At Appomattox Courthouse, a quiet village in central Virginia, the end arrived. On April 9, 1865, Lee met Grant in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's home. The two men, opposites in background and style, Lee dignified and formal, Grant plain and mud-splattered, agreed to terms of surrender. Lee's soldiers would lay down their arms, but be allowed to return home, taking their horses with them for spring planting. It was an honorable peace, marking the collapse of the Confederacy. With that surrender, Virginia once again stood at the heart of history. The state that had given birth to the Union and then led it into rebellion was now the place where the war ended. From Bull Run to Appomattox, Virginia had been the crucible of the Civil War, its soil stained by battles that decided the fate of a nation. For Virginians, the war left scars that would never fully heal. Plantations lay in ruin, cities burned, families torn apart. The enslaved, whose labor had built the wealth of the Old Dominion, seized freedom in the war's upheaval. Some joined Union lines, others simply walked away from fields and mansions that had claimed them as property. In Richmond, in Petersburg, in countless villages, emancipation became reality, though the struggle for true equality was only beginning. For the white elite, defeat was bitter, their dreams of a Confederate nation reduced to ashes. For poor farmers, the loss was measured in sons buried and livelihoods shattered. Virginia's place as the heart of the Confederacy had been both pride and curse. It gave the rebellion its capital and its greatest general, but it also made the state the principal battlefield, absorbing more destruction than almost any other. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox, the war was not truly over. Confederate armies still fought in other places. But for many, Virginia's surrender meant the end. The Old Dominion, once cradle of presidents and ideals of liberty, had also been the cradle of secession and the stage for America's bloodiest conflict. As the guns fell silent, the nation looked to rebuild. But for Virginia, the path forward would be fraught with hardship. The war that had begun with the promise of glory had ended in devastation, leaving behind questions that no victory could easily answer. How would freedom be defined for the newly emancipated? How would the shattered economy recover? How would Virginians reconcile their legacy as both founders of the Republic and leaders of rebellion? Those questions would define the next era. But in 1865, all that was certain was this: Virginia had been the beating heart of the Civil War, and its soil bore the price of a divided nation. Chapter 12: Reconstruction and Resistance. When Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, the cannons fell silent. But Virginia's true reckoning had only begun. The state that had once been the proud cradle of American independence and later the beating heart of the Confederacy now lay in ruin. Its fields were scarred by trenches, its cities blackened by fire, its plantations stripped of wealth, and its people haunted by the memory of 4 years of slaughter. More than 100,000 Virginians had died in the conflict. Families mourned, farms stood empty, and the economy that had once revolved around enslaved labor collapsed overnight. For the newly freed men and women, the end of the war brought jubilation and hope. For the defeated white population, it brought humiliation, confusion, and fear of what the future would hold. Reconstruction was not only about rebuilding Virginia's roads, farms, and towns. It was about redefining freedom itself, about deciding what kind of society would rise from the ashes of the old. The most profound change came with emancipation. Nearly 500,000 enslaved people in Virginia found themselves free. Freedom came in waves. Some had walked off plantations during the war. Others had joined Union armies, and many waited until Union troops occupied their counties before daring to leave. Their first acts of freedom were often deeply personal: choosing a surname, reuniting with family members sold away, or walking proudly on roads they once traveled in chains. Churches sprang up across the countryside, built by Black communities who saw faith as both a spiritual refuge and a place to organize schools, mutual aid societies, and political meetings. Education, long denied to enslaved people, became a burning priority. Freedmen and women crowded into makeshift classrooms, eager to learn letters and numbers, often taught by Northern missionaries or by black teachers who themselves had just learned to read. But freedom was fragile. The end of slavery did not mean equality, nor did it guarantee prosperity. Many freedmen became sharecroppers, renting small plots from former masters in exchange for a portion of the harvest. While sharecropping offered independence on paper, in practice it often trapped black families in cycles of debt and poverty. Land ownership, the dream of many, was rarely achieved. Federal authorities debated whether confiscated plantations should be divided among freed people, the famous promise of 40 acres and a mule. But in Virginia, as in much of the South, that promise went largely unfulfilled. Land remained in the hands of white planters, while the freedmen labored once more in fields they did not own. To manage the transition, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865. In Virginia, bureau agents established schools, mediated labor contracts, and provided relief for both black and white families devastated by the war. The Bureau represented, for a time, the presence of federal power in daily life, yet its reach was limited, its resources stretched thin, and its authority often resented by white Virginians who viewed it as outside interference. Violence simmered in the countryside, where former Confederates resisted change through intimidation and sometimes bloodshed. For freed people, every assertion of independence carried risk. To vote, to hold office, to testify in court, all were revolutionary acts in a society that had once denied their humanity. Virginia was placed under military occupation as part of congressional Reconstruction. Federal troops patrolled streets and courthouses, ensuring new laws were enforced and that freedmen could exercise their rights. In 1867, Congress required former Confederate states to draft new constitutions guaranteeing black suffrage before rejoining the Union. In Virginia, this led to the Constitutional Convention of 1867 to 1868, often called the Underwood Convention, after its presiding officer, Judge John Underwood. For the first time in Virginia's history, black men sat as delegates, debating alongside whites about the state's future. The resulting Constitution expanded the right to vote, created a system of public education, and redefined the Commonwealth's laws to reflect the reality of emancipation. The moment was extraordinary. Formerly enslaved men voted, held office, and influenced policy. They served on juries, organized political clubs, and made their voices heard in a society that had once silenced them. For many white Virginians, especially the old planter elite, this was an unbearable reversal of the social order. They saw Reconstruction as an insult, a punishment imposed by outsiders and enforced by bayonets. To freed people, however, it was a brief glimpse of justice, a fragile chance to shape the world their children would inherit. Yet that chance was short-lived. By the 1870s, federal resolve began to waver. The North grew weary of the cost of occupation and the constant battles over Southern governance. White Virginians, through organizations like the Conservative Party and later the Democratic Party, worked tirelessly to regain control. They appealed to white farmers and townsmen who resented federal troops and feared social equality. Gradually, redeemers, as they called themselves, dismantled the gains of Reconstruction. The withdrawal of federal troops in 1877 marked the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of a new era, one of resistance to change and the reassertion of white supremacy. Across Virginia, white leaders passed laws that restricted black political power. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and complicated registration systems chipped away at the right to vote. Violence and intimidation further suppressed black participation in politics. By the end of the century, most African Americans in Virginia had been effectively disenfranchised. It was in this period that the system known as Jim Crow took root. Named after a minstrel caricature, Jim Crow laws codified segregation in every aspect of life. Schools, railcars, restaurants, theaters, all were divided by race. Black Virginians, who had once walked into polling places and state legislatures, now found themselves relegated to the margins. The promise of equality written in Reconstruction constitutions was hollowed out by state laws and court decisions that upheld segregation as separate but equal, though the reality was anything but. For white Virginians, Jim Crow was framed as stability, a return to order after the chaos of war and Reconstruction. For black Virginians, it was a betrayal, the loss of freedoms they had risked everything to claim. And yet, even under the weight of segregation, black communities endured and adapted. They built churches, schools, and businesses that served as centers of strength. They organized mutual aid societies, newspapers, and advocacy groups. The spirit of resistance did not die. It went underground, gathering strength for future generations. Virginia's Reconstruction era was therefore a story of both hope and disappointment, of brief advances followed by crushing setbacks. The Commonwealth had been forced to confront its legacy of slavery, but it chose to reassert much of that legacy under new forms. Federal occupation had brought unprecedented changes. Black suffrage, public schools, civil rights protections. But when that occupation ended, Virginia resisted those changes with vigor. The result was a society rebuilt not on equality, but on segregation. A society that proclaimed progress while entrenching injustice. Still, the memory of Reconstruction lingered. Black Virginians remembered the years when they voted, when they held office, when they walked into schools built for their children. Those memories became seeds for future struggles. And white Virginians remembered too with bitterness and resentment, fueling the myths of the lost cause that painted Reconstruction as tyranny and the Confederacy as noble. Those competing memories would shape Virginia's identity for generations. By the dawn of the 20th century, Virginia had emerged from the wreckage of war, but not from the shadow of slavery. The fields were once again green, the cities rebuilt, the economy recovering through industry and agriculture. But the old divisions remained, hardened by law and custom. Reconstruction had promised a new birth of freedom. Resistance had ensured that freedom was partial and incomplete. Virginia, like the rest of the South, stood at a crossroads it had chosen to take backward rather than forward. The story of Reconstruction in Virginia was not a simple arc of progress or failure. It was a struggle, messy, incomplete, and bitter. It showed what was possible when federal power enforced equality, and it revealed how fragile those possibilities were when that power was withdrawn. It left behind both institutions that endured, like the public school system, and scars that festered, like the deep divisions of race and class. Above all, it left questions that Virginia would grapple with long after the last federal soldier marched away. What did freedom truly mean? Who would share in it? And how could a state so steeped in contradiction reconcile its past with its future? For now, in the years after Appomattox, Virginia rebuilt. But the foundations of that rebuilding were laid in compromise and resistance, not in justice. The Old Dominion, humbled but unbowed, adjusted to a new reality, one that preserved much of the old hierarchy under new names. The war had ended, slavery had fallen, but the struggle for freedom was far from over. Chapter 13. The New South. The guns of the Civil War had long since fallen silent, but in Virginia the echoes of that conflict lingered in every field, every courthouse, and every memory. The Old Dominion, once the beating heart of the Confederacy, entered a new era after Reconstruction, an era that many called the New South. It was a phrase filled with hope, with visions of progress, but also with sharp edges of reality. For while industry rose from the ashes and cities began to hum with the sound of locomotives and factories, the iron bars of segregation locked an entire people into second-class status. Virginia, like much of the South, tried to redefine itself in these decades, straddling two worlds, one of tradition and one of change. The foundation of this New South rested first on the land itself. Tobacco had been Virginia's crop since the days of John Rolfe, and even after emancipation, it continued to dominate the state's economy. Freedmen, who now rented land as sharecroppers or tenant farmers, often found themselves bound to cycles of debt that mirrored the bondage they had escaped. Landowners offered seeds and tools on credit, then claimed the lion's share of the harvest. For African Americans, freedom did not bring prosperity. It brought a new kind of struggle. Still, the fields of tobacco leaf continued to roll out toward the horizon, the pungent scent of curing barns filling the air. A reminder of the crop that had once made Virginia rich and that still tethered it to the soil. But tobacco alone could not carry Virginia into the future. The war had shown the South's dependence on agriculture and the North's dominance in industry. Reformers, politicians, and business leaders began to speak of railroads, steel, and coal as the true symbols of the progress. Nowhere was this more evident than in the boomtown of Roanoke. What had been a sleepy village transformed almost overnight into a bustling city thanks to the Norfolk and Western Railway. Tracks carved through mountains and valleys, carrying coal from the mines of southwest Virginia to ports on the coast. Steam locomotives, belching black smoke into the air, became the engines not only of transportation, but of economic transformation. With the railroads came workers, factories, hotels, and a new sense that Virginia was not just a land of planters and plantations, but of steel and steam. Coal was king in the mountains. In the Southwest, deep beneath the ridges of Appalachia, miners swung pickaxes and lit lamps, pulling black gold from the earth. The coal fields of Virginia became central to the state's modernization, fueling trains, factories, and furnaces. Yet with this wealth came hardship. Miners lived in company towns, paid in scrip rather than money, tied to the stores and houses owned by their employers. Strikes and labor unrest simmered as men risked their lives underground, and communities teetered between the promise of prosperity and the chains of exploitation. Virginia's coal would fuel progress, but it also revealed the same patterns of inequality and control that had haunted the state since colonial days. Cities grew with this new wealth. Richmond, already scarred by the Civil War, rose again, its skyline marked now not by church spires alone, but by smokestacks. Norfolk expanded with its port, handling not only tobacco but also coal and timber, becoming one of the most important harbors on the eastern seaboard. Small towns blossomed into regional centers, connected by rail and telephone wires, infused with the energy of a people eager to show that Virginia was modern forward-looking, part of a United States that was industrializing at a breathtaking pace. Yet, even as the iron horse thundered through the valleys and factories buzzed with activity, another structure was being built. Not of steel or brick, but of laws and customs. The system of segregation, hardened into permanence during this era, defined Virginia's social order as surely as railroads defined its economy. The Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 gave legal sanction to separate but equal, and Virginia wasted no time embedding it into every corner of daily life. Schools became divided by race. White children attended classrooms with better supplies and better funding, while black children struggled in buildings that were often little more than wooden shacks. Public spaces, from train cars to theaters to water fountains, were marked by signs that reminded African Americans of their supposed place. Poll taxes and literacy tests whittled away at the political gains Black Virginians had made during Reconstruction. And by the dawn of the 20th century, their voices were largely silenced at the ballot box. It was a cruel irony. At the very moment Virginia was stepping into modernity, it was also stepping backward into a rigid hierarchy that enshrined white supremacy. Leaders of the state, the so-called Bourbon Democrats, justified this as stability. They claimed it was necessary to maintain order, to prevent the chaos they insisted would come if African Americans gained full equality. But behind their words was fear. The fear of losing power, of losing control, of confronting the legacy of slavery that could not be so easily erased. African Americans, however, did not accept this fate silently. They built their own communities, churches, businesses, and schools, carving out spaces of dignity and resilience within a hostile system. In Richmond, leaders like John Mitchell, Jr., editor of the Richmond Planet, used the press to call out injustice and rally African Americans to resist oppression. Booker T. Washington, though born in nearby West Virginia, was educated in Virginia and carried the lessons of Hampton Institute with him as he urged vocational training as a path forward for Black Americans. There were debates within the community between those who sought accommodation and those who demanded equality. But through it all, Virginia's Black population fought to keep alive the hope of freedom's promise. Meanwhile, white Virginians embraced the mythology of the lost cause, romanticizing the Confederacy and rewriting the story of the Civil War to emphasize honor, valor, and states' rights rather than slavery. Monuments to Confederate generals rose in Richmond, turning city streets into avenues of memory and myth. These statues were not merely stone and bronze. They were political statements, reminders to all who passed that the old orders still cast a long shadow. The cult of the lost cause allowed Virginians to honor their past, even as they claimed to be building a modern future. The tension between progress and tradition defined Virginia in these decades. Industrial wealth created new elites, railroad magnates, coal barons, and urban businessmen, who joined the ranks of the old planter families in shaping policy and society. They built mansions in the cities to rival the plantations of the countryside, symbols of a new kind of aristocracy. Yet for the majority, whether sharecroppers in the fields, miners in the mountains, or laborers in the factories, life was harsh, wages low, and opportunities scarce. Education, too, reflected this divide. The state slowly expanded public schooling, but always under the cloud of segregation. For white Virginians, schools were touted as signs of progress, a way to prepare their children for an industrial economy. For Black Virginians, Education was underfunded and deliberately weakened, as white leaders feared that too much learning would challenge the racial order. Still, within their limited means, African American communities built strong traditions of literacy and learning, determined that knowledge would be a weapon against oppression. By the close of the 19th century, Virginia stood at a crossroads. It was no longer the purely agrarian land of Jefferson's dreams, nor was it yet the fully industrial powerhouse that northern states had become. It was something in between, a place where trains linked farms to markets, where coal dust blackened the hands of men in the mountains, where tobacco warehouses still bustled, and where cities reached toward the modern age. But under it all, the color line remained sharp and unforgiving, ensuring that modernization did not mean equality. The New South had promised rebirth. In Virginia, it delivered progress wrapped in contradiction. There was pride in new industries, pride in rebuilt cities, pride in a state that had once been defeated and now showed signs of resurgence. But there was also pain. Pain in the broken promises of freedom, in the chains of segregation, in the lives of men and women trapped by poverty and prejudice. The story of Virginia in this era was not a simple march forward. It was a story of dualities: wealth and want, progress and prejudice, hope and despair. As the 20th century loomed, these contradictions would only deepen. The seeds of future struggles over civil rights, over labor, over memory itself, had already been sown in the soil of the New South. Virginia, the Old Dominion, carried its past into its future, a state forever balancing between the traditions of its history and the demands of modern America. Chapter 14: World Wars and the Changing Face of Virginia. The 20th century arrived with its promises of progress, yet also with the specter of conflicts that would draw Virginia into a far wider world. The Old Dominion had long been a land where the past weighed heavily, its fields marked by the ghosts of earlier wars, its cities bearing monuments to memory. But now, new wars, global in scale and modern in nature, would reshape Virginia's identity in ways that Jefferson, Washington, or even Lee could scarcely have imagined. World War I and World War II did not just call Virginians to battlefields overseas. They transformed the state itself, turning it into a hub of military might, industrial power, and modern identity. When war erupted in Europe in 1914, Virginia at first seemed distant from the trenches of the Western Front. Life continued in its towns and fields, the rhythms of tobacco harvests and coal shipments largely undisturbed. But the world was shrinking. And when the United States entered the war in 1917, Virginia was pulled into the orbit of global conflict. Camps sprang up across the state, training grounds for soldiers who would be shipped across the Atlantic to fight. Camp Lee near Petersburg became one of the largest, its rows of barracks and drill fields echoing with the footsteps of thousands of recruits. Richmond streets filled with parades and recruitment drives, and families sent their sons off with both pride and fear, knowing that Europe's war was now America's war, and by extension, Virginia's too. The war effort also expanded Virginia's industry. Shipyards in Newport News swelled with contracts, building vessels to transport troops and supplies. Coal from the Appalachian mines powered ships, trains, and factories, and railroads surged with traffic. The state's economy, still recovering from the agricultural dependence of the previous century, tasted the wealth of wartime production. But it was not only economics that shifted. Social patterns began to change as well. African Americans, long trapped in cycles of sharecropping, began to leave Virginia in greater numbers, heading north in what would become known as the Great Migration. They sought jobs in the factories of Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, leaving behind the strictures of Jim Crow for the promise, however uncertain, of a freer life. Those who stayed faced discrimination even as they served in uniform. But the very act of service planted seeds of future demands for equality. The end of World War I left Virginia with mixed legacies. Monuments were erected to honor the fallen, communities remembered their sacrifices, and the state's growing military infrastructure remained in place. But the war also exposed divisions between white and black Virginians, between rural farmers and urban workers, between those who clung to tradition and those who sensed a new world was dawning. For a time, the 1920s brought optimism. Norfolk and Hampton roads expanded, Richmond bustled with commerce, and Roanoke grew as a railroad city. Yet under the surface, old hierarchies remained, and the Great Depression of the 1930s would remind Virginians that progress was fragile. It was World War II, however, that would forever change Virginia's identity. When the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 thrust the United States into total war, Virginia's strategic location on the Atlantic coast made it one of the most vital states in the nation's defense. Norfolk became a cornerstone of naval operations. The Norfolk Naval Base, already important in World War I, grew into the largest naval station in the world. Ships crowded its harbors, planes buzzed overhead, and thousands of sailors passed through its gates. Newport News shipbuilding became a hive of activity, launching aircraft carriers, battleships, and troop transports that carried American power across the globe. The war transformed not only the coast, but the entire state. Military bases multiplied. Fort Lee near Petersburg trained quartermasters. Camp Pickett prepared soldiers, Langley Field housed aircraft, and Quantico became synonymous with the Marine Corps. These installations brought jobs, infrastructure, and federal investment, embedding the military into Virginia's economy and daily life. The state, once proud of its agrarian traditions, now found its future tied to steel, machinery, and the armed forces. Industry followed suit. Factories hummed with production of uniforms, weapons, and supplies. The textile mills of Danville produced clothing for soldiers, while Richmond's factories manufactured goods ranging from cigarettes to critical war equipment. The coal mines once again fed the fires of war, and railroads became arteries pumping men and materiel to the ports. Women stepped into roles once reserved for men, working in shipyards and offices, Rosie the Riveter figures, who proved that Virginia's daughters could weld steel and keep production lines moving as well as their brothers could. For African Americans, the war carried both opportunity and bitter irony. Thousands enlisted or were drafted, serving in segregated units, often relegated to support roles. Yet their service, their sacrifice, and the taste of broader horizons brought back by returning veterans would intensify calls for equality at home. The Double V campaign, victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism, resonated in Virginia. It did not topple segregation, not yet, but it exposed the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom overseas while denying it in Norfolk, Richmond, and beyond. World War II also accelerated the urbanization of Virginia. The massive influx of workers to shipyards, bases, and factories swelled city populations. Norfolk, Portsmouth, and Newport News expanded rapidly, while even inland cities like Richmond felt the pulse of war-driven prosperity. Farms still dotted the countryside, but increasingly Virginians found their lives tied to industrial paychecks rather than crops. Automobiles became more common, highways expanded, and the post-war years would only deepen this transformation. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Virginia stood transformed. The war had left scars, grief for the fallen, rationing that had pinched daily life, and the struggles of returning veterans adjusting to civilian existence. But it had also left new foundations. Military bases remained, shipyards continued to thrive, and industries that had grown fat on wartime contracts sought peacetime markets. The GI Bill brought a new generation of Virginians into colleges and universities, reshaping education and opening doors once closed to the poor. Suburbs began to sprout outside cities, particularly in Northern Virginia, where proximity to Washington, D.C. drew government workers and contractors into what would become a booming region. Virginia's identity, so long defined by its past, now faced forward. No longer just the land of Jefferson's farms or Lee's battlefields, it was becoming the land of aircraft carriers, federal agencies, and modern industry. Yet the transition was not without tension. Segregation still clung to schools and public spaces. Veterans who had risked their lives abroad returned to find themselves denied the right to vote. Rural communities struggled to keep pace with the fast-moving changes of urban and industrial growth. The contradictions of the New South persisted, but they now played out in a state increasingly tied to national and global currents. The world wars had done what no earlier event could. They had pulled Virginia decisively into the 20th century. The state's ports and bases tied it to the defense of the nation. Its industries integrated it into the national economy. And its people were no longer just Virginians, but Americans engaged with the world. Old symbols remained. Confederate statues still lined Richmond's avenues, tobacco still dried in barns. But beside them rose aircraft hangars, war memorials, and modern highways. The past and future stood side by side, sometimes clashing, sometimes blending, but always shaping a new face for Virginia. As the mid-century approached, Virginia found itself more central than ever. Its sons and daughters had fought in 2 global wars. Its land had trained soldiers, launched ships, and flown planes that carried freedom to distant shores. Its economy had shifted from plows to production lines, from barns to bases. And its people, both white and black, had been tested by the demands of war, the promises of progress, and the persistence of injustice. The story of Virginia in the age of world wars was a story of transformation, sudden, profound, and irreversible. The Commonwealth that emerged in 1945 was no longer the Virginia of the lost cause or the Virginia of endless tobacco fields. It was something newer, more complex, more connected. It was a state at once proud of its heritage and aware that its future would be forged not in isolation, but in the swirling tides of national and global change. The face of Virginia had changed, and it would continue to change. The seeds planted during these decades of modernization, of military dependence, of racial challenge, of suburban growth, would bear fruit in the years ahead. The wars had passed, but their imprint remained, etched into the cities, the economy, and the very identity of the Old Dominion, as it moved into the uncertain yet promising decades of the 20th century. Chapter 15. The Civil Rights Struggle in Virginia. The end of the Second World War had thrust Virginia into the modern age, but while battleships, highways, and suburban homes marked progress, another conflict was brewing within the state's borders. It was not fought with rifles or artillery, but with laws, protests, and courtrooms. It was the struggle to reconcile Virginia's long history of segregation with the rising demand for equality, a struggle that would shake the Old Dominion to its core and force it to confront the very foundations of its social order. The seeds of this conflict had been sown generations earlier, in the fields where enslaved people labored and in the classrooms where black children were offered scraps of education while white children sat in new brick schools. Jim Crow had cemented the divide, codifying segregation into daily life. Separate buses, separate bathrooms, separate schools. Virginia was proud of its traditions, but by the middle of the 20th century, those traditions were colliding with a national movement determined to bring change. The spark came not from Virginia, but from the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. In 1954, in the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education, the court ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The decision sent shockwaves across the South. But nowhere was the resistance more determined than in Virginia. For many white Virginians, integration was not just about classrooms. It threatened an entire way of life, a social hierarchy that had stood unchallenged for centuries. The ruling was seen as an intrusion, a command from far away that sought to undo what they believed was the natural order of their communities. Virginia's political leaders responded with defiance. At the forefront was Senator Harry F. Byrd Sr., the powerful head of what was known as the Byrd Organization, a political machine that dominated Virginia politics for decades. Byrd called for massive resistance, a strategy to use every tool at the state's disposal to block desegregation. He rallied legislators, governors, and citizens to stand against the federal mandate, insisting that Virginia would never submit to forced integration. What followed was one of the most dramatic episodes in Virginia's modern history. In 1956, the state government adopted a series of laws designed to prevent integration. Schools that attempted to desegregate could be shut down by the governor. State funds would be cut off from integrated schools, and tuition grants were offered to white families who wanted to enroll their children in private academies rather than attend integrated public schools. It was a deliberate attempt to use the machinery of government to resist the Constitution itself. The effects were immediate and devastating. In some communities, schools were shuttered entirely rather than comply with integration orders. Nowhere was this more infamous than in Prince Edward County. In 1959, when federal courts ordered the county to desegregate its public schools, local officials responded by closing the entire school system rather than admit black students alongside white students. For 5 years, from 1959 to 1964, Prince Edward County had no public schools at all. White children attended hastily organized private academies funded by state tuition grants and private donations. But black children were left with almost nothing. Some families cobbled together makeshift classes in church basements. Others sent their children to relatives in neighboring counties or even out of state. But thousands simply went without formal education. The Prince Edward County school closings became a national scandal, a symbol of the extremes to which segregationists would go to preserve the old order. For black families, it was a bitter betrayal, proof that the promises of democracy could be denied at home, even as America claimed to be a beacon of freedom abroad. For white leaders, it was framed as a defense of states' rights, an assertion of Virginia's sovereignty against federal intrusion. But history would remember it as an act of cruelty, one that scarred a generation of children and exposed the deep wounds of racial inequality. The fight for equality in Virginia was not limited to schools. though education became the most visible battleground. Across the state, African Americans organized, protested, and brought lawsuits challenging segregation in buses, libraries, and public facilities. Churches became centers of activism, with ministers preaching not only spiritual salvation, but also social justice. Students, too, played a critical role. At places like Virginia State College and Hampton Institute, young men and women organized sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, demanding the simple dignity of being served a meal. Inspired by the national civil rights movement, they brought the struggle directly to the streets of Richmond, Norfolk, and other cities. The resistance they faced was fierce. White citizens' councils sprang up, determined to maintain segregation. Police arrested demonstrators, judges handed down fines, and mobs sometimes met peaceful protesters with threats and violence. Yet the movement did not stop. Each march, each sit-in, each court case chipped away at the walls of segregation, forcing Virginia to reckon with change. The federal government, too, began to intervene more forcefully. Court rulings struck down Virginia's school closing laws, declaring them unconstitutional. In Prince Edward County, after years of legal battles, the Supreme Court finally ordered the schools reopened in 1964, marking the end of the most extreme example of massive resistance. It was a victory, but one that came at enormous cost to the children who had been denied their education. By the mid-1960s, Virginia was reluctantly moving toward compliance with federal civil rights laws. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 brought new protections, outlawing segregation in public accommodations and ensuring the right to vote for African Americans. But while the legal barriers began to fall, the social and cultural divide remained. Many white families continued to send their children to private academies, which became known as segregation academies, while public schools struggled to integrate in practice as well as on paper. The legacy of massive resistance lingered, a reminder that progress in Virginia came not easily, but through struggle and sacrifice. Black leaders emerged who had been forged in the fires of this era, men and women who carried the fight into politics, education, and community leadership. Their determination built on the courage of those who had endured the closures, the protests, and the arrests, refusing to surrender their right to equality. At the same time, Virginia itself was changing. The urban growth of Northern Virginia, fueled by federal jobs and suburban expansion, brought new populations less tied to the old traditions of segregation. Richmond, Norfolk, and other cities began to diversify, and though racism did not disappear, the rigid system of Jim Crow was crumbling. The state that had once declared it would resist at all costs was now being pulled, however reluctantly, into a new era. The civil rights struggle in Virginia was never just about schools or buses. It was about identity. It forced the state to confront whether it would remain a place bound by the past or become part of a more inclusive future. The battles were painful, the setbacks numerous, and the resistance fierce. But slowly, steadily, the tide shifted. The walls of segregation, once thought unbreakable, began to crack under the pressure of a people who refused to be silenced. As the 1970s approached, Virginia was no longer the same state that had pledged massive resistance in the 1950s. Its schools were reopening, its laws were changing, and its people, black and white alike, were grappling with the meaning of equality in a society still scarred by division. The struggle was far from over, but it had left a mark on Virginia as deep as any battlefield or monument. It was a different kind of war, fought not with cannons, but with courage, not on distant fields, but in classrooms, courtrooms, and city streets. And its outcome would define not just Virginia, but the nation itself. Chapter 16. Modern Virginia. By the time Virginia emerged from the turbulence of the Civil Rights era, it was already a state in transition. For centuries, tobacco had been the crop that defined Virginia's identity, fueling its economy from Jamestown to the plantations of the gentry, shaping its politics, and even marking its contradictions between liberty and slavery. But as the 20th century entered its final decades, tobacco's hold on the Old Dominion began to loosen. A new Virginia was taking shape, one no longer defined only by its farms and fields, but increasingly by suburban sprawl, gleaming office towers, research universities, and humming data centers. The past had not disappeared, but it was being joined, and in some places eclipsed, by a future built on technology, education, and culture. The shift began slowly. After World War II, suburban growth had already started to transform parts of the state, especially near Washington, D.C. The quiet farmland of Northern Virginia, dotted with small towns and winding country roads, began to change as federal workers sought homes outside the capital. The completion of highways and bridges tied Virginia's northern counties more tightly to Washington. And by the 1960s and 1970s, the transformation was accelerating. Fairfax County, once a rural community, became one of the fastest-growing counties in the United States, a symbol of Virginia's new suburban frontier. As families moved into tract houses and new subdivisions, schools, shopping malls, and office parks followed. What had once been the southern edge of the nation's capital was morphing into something larger. A sprawling region where federal government contracts, military installations, and private industry intertwined. The growth of the Pentagon in nearby Arlington and the expansion of the federal bureaucracy during the Cold War pumped billions of dollars into Northern Virginia. Defense contractors set up offices, high-tech companies sought proximity to Washington, and suburban Virginia became one of the wealthiest regions in the nation. At the heart of this transformation was a new kind of economy. No longer could Virginia rely primarily on agriculture or even traditional manufacturing. Instead, information, technology, and services were taking center stage. In the final decades of the 20th century, Virginia became home to what would later be called the Internet Alley. Along Route 267, in what became known as the Dulles Technology Corridor, data centers, telecommunications firms, and startups flourished. Fiber optic cables snaked through the region, and by the dawn of the 21st century, much of the world's internet traffic was coursing through servers in Northern Virginia. What had once been tobacco fields now hummed with the invisible currents of the digital age. Yet this new prosperity did not erase Virginia's traditions. Tobacco remained an important industry well into the late 20th century, even as health concerns mounted. The iconic cigarette companies headquartered in Richmond, like Philip Morris, continued to wield enormous influence. Advertising and lobbying kept tobacco central to Virginia's economy and culture, even as lawsuits and public health campaigns chipped away at its dominance. Slowly, however, the golden leaf that had once defined the colony's wealth gave way to the silicon chip and the glowing screen. Virginia's transformation was not just economic. It was cultural and educational as well. The state's universities expanded and flourished, attracting students from across the country and around the world. The University of Virginia in Charlottesville, founded by Jefferson, became a leading research institution, blending its classical architecture with cutting-edge programs. Virginia Tech in Blacksburg grew into a powerhouse of engineering and science, its graduates fueling the very technology companies reshaping the state. George Mason University in Fairfax, once a small branch campus, exploded in size, reflecting the growth of Northern Virginia itself and establishing a reputation for law, economics, and public policy. William and Mary, long one of the nation's oldest colleges, balanced history and innovation, bridging past and future. These universities did more than educate. They tied Virginia to the global flow of knowledge and ideas. Research contracts, partnerships with corporations, and the recruitment of international students gave the state a cosmopolitan edge. In classrooms and laboratories, Virginia was not just consuming technology, it was helping to invent it. Meanwhile, the suburbs grew ever outward. Families who once lived in compact neighborhoods now spread into subdivisions that reached into Loudoun and Prince William counties. Shopping centers, office towers, and highways multiplied, creating both prosperity and congestion. The skyline of Tyson's Corner, once a crossroads of farmland, filled with glass towers and corporate logos. Northern Virginia became a land of commuters, where the hum of traffic on Interstate 66 or the Beltway was as much a part of daily life as the songs of cicadas on a summer night. This suburban expansion also brought new diversity. As jobs multiplied, immigrants arrived from Asia, Latin America, and Africa, adding to Virginia's cultural fabric. In Fairfax and Arlington, grocery stores offered foods from Korea, El Salvador, and Ethiopia. Churches, mosques, and temples reflected new communities that were reshaping what it meant to be a Virginian. No longer was the state only the domain of families whose roots stretched back to the Revolution. It was now a place where new Americans sought opportunity, bringing languages, traditions, and aspirations from around the world. Even as Northern Virginia surged ahead, other parts of the state struggled to keep pace. Coal country in the Southwest faced decline as mines closed and jobs disappeared. Towns that had once thrived on manufacturing or textiles saw factories shutter. The divide between the booming tech hubs near Washington and the struggling rural communities of Appalachia grew sharper, creating an economic and political contrast that still defined Virginia's identity. In some ways, the state was two places at once: a futuristic hub of technology and wealth in the north, and a region grappling with decline in the south and west. Politically, this shift reshaped Virginia. Once a stronghold of conservative politics under the Byrd Organization, the influx of new populations and industries began to tilt the state in new directions. Suburban voters brought different priorities: education, infrastructure, and technology, while younger generations questioned the old ways of doing things. The civil rights era had cracked open the structures of segregation, and now the forces of suburbanization and globalization were reshaping the electorate even further. Virginia's political identity, once predictable, became more fluid, reflecting the diversity of its modern population. Culturally, too, Virginia experienced a revival. Historic preservation flourished as communities recognized the value of their past. Williamsburg reinvented itself as a living museum, drawing visitors eager to glimpse colonial life. Monticello and Mount Vernon welcomed tourists who wanted to connect with Jefferson and Washington. At the same time, new cultural institutions rose. Wolf Trap National Park for the Performing Arts brought music and theater to the suburbs, while museums in Richmond and Norfolk highlighted both Virginia's history and its contemporary art. Festivals celebrated not just traditional crafts and foods, but also the cuisines and music of immigrant communities, creating a tapestry of old and new. Technology, education, diversity, and culture intertwined to create a Virginia that was no longer simply the old dominion of plantations and tobacco, but a state of contradictions and possibilities. It was a place where the ruins of old tobacco warehouses stood not far from glass-walled data centers, where Jefferson's ideals echoed even as global corporations set up headquarters, where the ghosts of Jim Crow lingered even as new communities flourished. By the end of the 20th century, Virginia had undergone one of the most remarkable transformations in its long history. The colony that had once depended on a single crop now depended on networks of information and capital. The state that had once been synonymous with rebellion and slavery was becoming synonymous with high-tech corridors and political influence. For in addition to its economic might, Virginia's proximity to Washington, D.C. gave it a voice in national affairs. Northern Virginia became a home for policymakers, lobbyists, and think tanks, blending seamlessly into the machinery of American governance. To speak of Virginia in this era was not only to speak of its past, it was to speak of its central role in the nation's future. And yet, even as the glass towers rose and the internet pulsed through Virginia's wires, the old tobacco barns and battlefields remained. The past was never far away. It lingered in the names of streets and counties, in the plantations preserved as museums, in the debates over monuments and memory. The tension between past and future, between tradition and innovation, defined modern Virginia as much as it had defined the colony in its earliest days. This was the new Virginia, a state still bound to its heritage, but propelled by the engines of technology, education, and diversity into a future its earliest settlers could never have imagined. The story of Virginia had always been one of reinvention, from native lands to colony, from rebellion to republic, from slavery to freedom. And now, in the modern age, it was reinventing itself once again. The golden leaf of tobacco still hung in memory, but the glow of computer screens and the hum of data centers marked a new chapter in the life of the Old Dominion. Chapter 17. A State of Contrasts. At the turn of the 21st century, Virginia stood at a crossroads. The story of the Old Dominion had always been one of reinvention, of a land that could hold on fiercely to its past even as it stepped into the future. In Jamestown, settlers had fought to survive. In Williamsburg, they debated the meaning of liberty. In Richmond, the Confederacy had burned and crumbled. And in Northern Virginia, glass towers now hummed with the invisible traffic of the internet. The state was layered like sediment, centuries of history lying just beneath the surface of highways, suburbs, and shopping centers. To walk across Virginia in the 2000s was to encounter a place that was at once the cradle of America and a battleground for its contradictions. Nowhere was that more visible than in the sharp contrast between regions. Northern Virginia had become almost unrecognizable from the farmland it once was. Fairfax, Loudoun, and Arlington counties were booming, filled with federal contractors, think tanks, and sprawling data centers that pulsed with global connectivity. The Dulles Technology Corridor was a world of high salaries, international restaurants, and crowded commuter trains, tied by culture and economy more to Washington, D.C., than to Virginia's heartland. Meanwhile, in the Appalachian Southwest, coal towns struggled with the decline of the mines that had once sustained them. Unemployment rose, young people moved away, and communities clung to traditions even as opportunities slipped away. One state, two realities, one marching into a high-tech future, the other holding on to an industrial past. These economic divides bled into politics. Virginia had long been known for its conservative establishment, rooted in the dominance of the Byrd organization and the traditions of the gentry. But as the 21st century dawned, the influx of newcomers into Northern Virginia brought change. Immigrants from Asia, Latin America, and Africa joined young professionals drawn to federal jobs and tech industries. Suburban voters were less bound to the old order, more diverse, more likely to favor moderate or progressive policies. As a result, Virginia became a political battleground. Once a reliable red state, it began to swing. Presidential elections turned on its votes, governors' races became national contests, and the state legislature shifted back and forth like a pendulum. The tension between red and blue was not simply a matter of partisanship. It reflected the state's deeper identity crisis. In the Shenandoah Valley and in coal country, guns, church, and conservative values remained central. In the suburbs outside Washington, diversity, education, and cosmopolitanism set the tone. Richmond and Hampton Roads fell somewhere in between, balancing their historic pasts with the realities of urban growth. Virginia's politics became a map of its geography. Red in the mountains, blue in the suburbs, purple along the shifting lines where they collided. The Old Dominion was no longer a political certainty. It was a microcosm of America's broader struggles. Culture, too, reflected this divide. On one hand, Virginians cherished their traditions. The state still celebrated its colonial heritage, still welcomed millions of visitors to Williamsburg, Monticello, and Mount Vernon. Civil War battlefields remained carefully preserved, their rolling fields dotted with monuments. County fairs, horse races, and festivals honored a rural identity that had persisted for generations. But alongside these traditions, Virginia was also becoming something entirely new. Korean barbecue restaurants lined suburban streets. Latino festivals filled parks with music and dance. Universities hosted international students who brought with them the languages and traditions of faraway lands. The face of Virginia was changing, and with it, the question of what it meant to be a Virginian. This question became especially pressing in debates over memory. As the 21st century progressed, Virginia found itself at the center of national conversations about monuments, history, and identity. Statues of Confederate generals, long regarded as untouchable symbols of Southern heritage, became flashpoints. In Richmond, Monument Avenue, once lined with towering tributes to Lee, Jackson, and Davis, was at the heart of fierce debates. To some, the statues were sacred markers of history. To others, they were symbols of oppression, standing in contradiction to the state's claims of equality and progress. Protests, lawsuits, and heated arguments filled the public square, revealing just how deeply the past still shaped the present. At the same time, Virginia leaned ever more into its role as a center of power and innovation. The Pentagon remained one of the largest employers in the state, drawing not only military personnel, but also entire industries devoted to defense and security. Northern Virginia became home to some of the world's largest data centers, the hidden backbone of the internet. Companies like Amazon planted roots, with Amazon's HQ2 decision in 2018 placing Arlington in the spotlight as a global hub of commerce and technology. Suddenly, Virginia was not only the land of Jefferson's Monticello or Washington's Mount Vernon. It was the land where the future of global technology was being decided. This rise of tech and suburban wealth contrasted sharply with the struggles of rural areas. In small towns far from the capital, hospitals closed, jobs disappeared, and schools faced declining enrollment. The opioid crisis hit hard, leaving scars across Appalachia and beyond. The wealth of Fairfax County, one of the richest in America, seemed a world apart from the poverty of Lee County on the Kentucky border. The contradictions were stark, and they raised difficult questions about the unity of the state. Was Virginia one story or many? Could a state defined by such disparity truly hold together as a commonwealth? And yet, there was resilience. Virginians continued to reinvent themselves, as they always had. Universities partnered with rural communities to provide new opportunities. Tech firms sought to expand beyond the Beltway, investing in research and development across the state. Tourism thrived, not only in the historic corridors of Williamsburg, but also in the natural beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Chesapeake Bay. Vineyards and breweries sprouted, creating a new industry of leisure and culture that attracted visitors from across the nation. Virginia was more than its contrasts. It was a blend, a place where old tobacco barns stood near new wineries, where Civil War trails crossed highways leading to high-tech campuses. The contradictions even extended to identity itself. Virginians were proud of being the mother of presidents, the birthplace of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. But they also carried the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and massive resistance. They celebrated independence at Yorktown and liberty in Patrick Henry's words, even as they struggled with the echoes of inequality. The 21st century brought no easy answers, only a recognition that Virginia's story had always been one of tension. To live in Virginia was to live with those contradictions, to acknowledge the past while shaping the future. As the new century unfolded, the state's role in national politics only deepened. Virginia became a swing state. Courted by both parties, its elections closely watched as bellwethers of broader trends. Debates over health care, immigration, guns, and education played out fiercely in its legislature. Governors from both parties rose to national prominence, reflecting the state's unpredictable balance. Virginia was no longer simply a southern state. It was a crossroads, a place where the country's struggles over identity, politics, and future direction collided. The story of 21st century Virginia was, in the end, a story of contrasts. It was the contrast between tobacco fields and data centers, between rural poverty and suburban wealth, between red counties and blue suburbs, between monuments of the past and innovations of the future. It was the story of a state that could never be pinned down to one definition, because it embodied too many at once. And perhaps that was Virginia's true legacy. Not as a state with one face, but as a state with many, each reflecting a different chapter of America's own story. As the sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains and rose again over the glass towers of Arlington, Virginians continued to live within these contrasts, balancing pride in tradition with hope for innovation. The Old Dominion, cradle of America, capital of rebellion, mother of presidents, and hub of the internet, remained what it had always been, a place of reinvention, of struggle, of vision, and of contradictions that defined not only itself, but the nation it helped to create. Epilogue: Virginia's legacy in American identity. To understand America, one must first understand Virginia. It is not only because Virginia is old, though it is, the first permanent English settlement planted in Jamestown, the cradle where the United States began its long and painful birth. It is not only because it gave the nation many of its earliest leaders, or because its soil has been soaked with both the victories and tragedies that shaped the Republic. It is because Virginia's story contains, in concentrated form, the very contradictions that define America itself. Liberty and slavery, democracy and exclusion, tradition and change. These twin forces pulled at Virginia for 4 centuries, and in that tug of war lies the essence of the American identity. From the beginning, Virginia carried a double legacy. On one hand, it was the place where Europeans dared to dream of a new life across the Atlantic, where fragile colonies grew into prosperous societies, where Patrick Henry demanded liberty and Thomas Jefferson declared equality. On the other, it was where enslaved Africans were first brought in chains in 1619, where freedom for some rested on bondage for many more, where hierarchies of race and class were stitched into the very fabric of daily life. America would always wrestle with the tension between those 2 legacies, and nowhere was that tension more visible than in the Old Dominion. The contradictions only deepened as Virginia rose to prominence. Its sons led the Revolution, yet its plantations thrived on human bondage. It built the first experiment in democracy with the House of Burgesses, yet denied the vote to women, the poor, and the enslaved. It gave the nation Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Yet it also gave the Confederacy its capital in Richmond. At every turn, Virginia mirrored America's greatest triumphs and its most painful failures, standing as a stage where the nation's central dramas unfolded. During the Civil War, Virginia was the heart of the rebellion, the land where Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Appomattox made history. Its soil bore witness to the bloodletting that decided whether the Union would survive. And in defeat, Virginia became a symbol of the nation's attempt to reconcile itself, to stitch together a republic torn apart. Reconstruction tested Virginia as it tested the whole country, promises of freedom clashing with the reality of Jim Crow. When the state chose resistance over reform, it again reflected a wider American struggle, a reluctance to fully embrace the ideals proclaimed in 1776. Yet Virginia never remained frozen. It adapted as America did. When tobacco's power faded, industry rose. When segregation began to crack, new communities and cultures flourished. Northern Virginia grew into a hub of technology and political influence, while the universities of Charlottesville, Blacksburg, and Williamsburg became centers of research and learning. The state reinvented itself again and again, just as the United States has always done. But the reinvention never erased the past. It only layered new chapters over old scars. What makes Virginia's legacy so central to American identity is not its perfection, but its imperfection. Its history is filled with lofty ideals and brutal realities, with voices that spoke of freedom and systems that enforced oppression. It is the birthplace of both the Declaration of Independence and the laws of massive resistance. It is the site of Jefferson's Monticello, with its vision of liberty, and of Prince Edward County, where children were denied schooling in the name of segregation. To study Virginia is to face the contradictions of America, to see clearly how the nation could proclaim equality while denying it, how it could cherish tradition while struggling toward change. Even in the 21st century, Virginia continues to embody the nation's contradictions. It is at once a conservative countryside and a progressive suburb, a land of Confederate monuments and immigrant festivals, a place where Civil War battlefields sit alongside data centers powering the digital age. Its politics swing between red and blue, its identity pulled between old loyalties and new realities. In its contrasts, one sees America itself, a nation never entirely at peace with its past, never entirely settled on its future, always balancing on the edge between continuity and reinvention. But perhaps that is Virginia's greatest gift to the American story, the reminder that contradictions are not signs of weakness, but signs of struggle. And struggle is at the core of democracy. Patrick Henry's cry for liberty, Jefferson's words of equality, Washington's leadership, Madison's vision for a constitution. These did not emerge in a vacuum. They were forged in the crucible of conflict, in a colony and then a state, where the ideals of freedom collided with the realities of power. That collision has never ceased. And it is precisely in that friction that America finds its identity. Virginia teaches us that the United States is not a finished story, but an ongoing experiment. Just as Virginia evolved, from native lands to Jamestown, from plantations to rebellion, from Civil War defeat to civil rights protests, from tobacco barns to technology hubs, so too has the nation continually reshaped itself. Each reinvention carries both hope and contradiction, both progress and resistance. To look at Virginia is to see the United States in miniature, a mirror reflecting both our achievements and our failures. When we walk through Virginia's landscapes, we walk through American memory. At Jamestown, we see the fragility of the first European foothold, the hunger, the disease, the uneasy alliances with native peoples. At Yorktown, we hear the echoes of freedom's victory, cannon signaling the birth of independence. At Richmond, we feel the heavy silence of a city that once dreamed of a Confederate empire and watched it collapse. At Appomattox, we witness the quiet surrender that ended a civil war and forced a nation to face itself. At Prince Edward County, we confront the injustice of closed schools and denied rights. And in the suburbs of Fairfax and the towers of Arlington, we glimpse the future, a global, diverse, technological world that still lives in the shadow of history. Understanding Virginia means understanding that freedom is fragile, that democracy must be constantly renewed, that the past is never truly gone. It means acknowledging that liberty for some is not liberty for all, that progress comes through struggle, that the contradictions of American life are not accidents, but inheritances. To study Virginia is not simply to study one state. It is to study the DNA of the nation. As the Old Dominion moves deeper into the 21st century, its legacy endures not only in monuments or museums, but in the debates that continue to shape the country. Questions of identity, equality, and power remain as alive today as they were in Patrick Henry's time. Virginia's role as both the cradle of America and the battleground of its contradictions ensures that its story will always matter. For to understand how America came to be, how it rose, how it faltered, and how it continues to struggle toward its ideals, one must return again and again to Virginia. The cradle of America was never simple, never pure. It was complex, flawed, and full of contradictions. And that, more than anything else, is why Virginia is America. Its legacy is the legacy of the nation itself, a legacy of freedom and slavery, democracy and exclusion, tradition and change. A legacy still being written,